Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Sometimes the most ordinary nights turn into mysteries that haunt us for years. This is the story of Christy Wilson, a young woman whose life was cut short on what should have been just another evening out. It's a tale of a determined mother, relentless investigators, and a secret that would remain buried for 15 years. The evening of October 4th, 2005 started like any other Tuesday for Christy Wilson. At 27 years old, Christy was in a transitional phase of her life. She had recently moved from San Jose to stay with her boyfriend, Danny Burlando, in his apartment in Sacramento. Christy was between jobs, but had promising prospects ahead. Just that week, she'd been talking excitedly to friends about a job interview coming up in San Francisco. She'd already received an offer and was looking forward to a fresh start. Christy had always been driven. Her mother, Debbie Boyd, remembered her as a standout student and athlete growing up in San Jose. She was focused, determined, someone who knew what she wanted and went after it. Her stepfather, Pat Boyd, was a detective with the San Jose Police Department, and Christy had grown up understanding discipline and the importance of staying connected with family. That Tuesday evening, Christy told Danny she was driving to Sacramento to collect the last of her belongings from storage. But instead of coming straight home, she decided to stop by Thunder Valley Casino in Lincoln, just north of Sacramento. Christy enjoyed gambling. She was good at it, friends said. It was her way of unwinding, of having a little fun when life felt heavy. Around 7 o'clock that evening, Christy walked through the bright, noisy entrance of Thunder Valley Casino. The casino floor was humming with activity. The electronic chimes of slot machines, the shuffle of cards, the low murmur of conversation blending with occasional bursts of laughter or groans of disappointment. Christy made her way to the blackjack tables, settling into a seat where she could watch the cards and lose herself in the rhythm of the game. At 10:28 p.m., Danny called her cell phone. Christy answered, her voice light and relaxed. She'd had a few drinks and had been enjoying herself. She told him she was finishing up soon and would head home shortly. Danny, comfortable and trusting, told her to drive safely. He went to bed that night expecting to wake up beside her. But somewhere in those final hours at Thunder Valley Casino, Christy's night took a turn she couldn't have anticipated. Surveillance cameras tracked her movements through the casino. She moved from table to table, at one point sitting down at a blackjack table around 11 o'clock. The footage showed her chatting with the dealer. Her demeanor relaxed, perhaps a little tipsy from the drinks she'd had. She was talking back to the dealer a bit, nothing aggressive. Just the playful banter that sometimes happens in casinos when the alcohol loosens inhibitions. It was then that a man sat down next to her. He leaned over, his voice calm and friendly. "Hey, calm down," he said. "We should probably leave this table." Christy, perhaps feeling a bit embarrassed or just ready for a change, agreed. The two of them got up and walked together to another table. She didn't know this man. They'd never met before that night. It was just one of those chance encounters that happen in places where strangers gather. A casino, a bar, a restaurant. The man's name was Mario Flavio Garcia. He was 53 years old, 26 years Christie's senior. He worked as a project manager for Sutter Health, an IT specialist by training. He was married with 2 teenage sons. On paper, he looked like a pillar of his community. A soccer coach, a family man, someone who showed up to work and did his job well. The casino's player membership system would later identify him. He'd been playing slot machines earlier in the evening before moving to the blackjack tables where he encountered Christy. For several hours, the two sat side by side, gambling, talking, passing the time the way strangers sometimes do. There was no indication that Christy felt threatened or uncomfortable. She was simply enjoying her evening. At 1:13 in the morning on October 5th, surveillance cameras captured Christy and Mario leaving the casino together. The footage shows them walking through the exit, heading toward the parking lot. At one point, Garcia reaches over, attempting to put his arm around Christy's shoulders. She quickly and firmly pushes his arm away, her body language clear. Then they walk together into the darkness of the parking lot, moving beyond the reach of the cameras, beyond what anyone could see. Security cameras did not cover the area where Garcia had parked his car. Investigators would later call this blind spot a black hole. Whatever happened in those next minutes occurred in complete darkness, away from any witness, any camera, any evidence, except what Christy herself would leave behind. Minutes later, surveillance footage captured Garcia's car leaving the parking lot. He appeared to be alone. When Danny Burlando woke up Wednesday morning, Christy wasn't there. At first, he wasn't alarmed. Maybe she'd stayed longer at the casino than planned. Maybe she'd decided to crash somewhere and sleep off the drinks. But as the hours passed, his concern grew. He called her cell phone over and over, leaving increasingly desperate messages. 10:15 on Wednesday. It's now been 24 hours since I talked to you last, and I'm worried sick about you. Please call me. If you're okay, call me. If you're not okay, call me. Let me know what's going on. But there was no response. No calls. No texts. Nothing. Christy's phone had actually been left behind at the casino. When she was sitting at the blackjack table that night, she tried to put her phone in her purse, but missed. It slipped under the table, left behind when she walked out with Mario Garcia. Without her phone, there was no GPS data to track. No location history, no digital breadcrumbs to follow. By Thursday, October 6th, Danny could wait no longer. He filed a missing persons report with the Placer County Sheriff's Department. Christy's mother, Debbie Boyd, got the call she'd been dreading since her daughter hadn't checked in. Something was terribly wrong. Christy was not the type to simply disappear. She was close with her family, especially her mother. They talked regularly. She was excited about her job interview. Everything about her disappearance felt wrong. Detective Don Murchison was assigned to the case. When he met with Danny, the boyfriend was cooperative, almost desperate to help. He gave investigators full access to the apartment, answered every question, provided phone records. Anything that might help find Christy. Danny even drove the 30 miles back to Thunder Valley Casino to check the parking lot himself. Christy's car was still there, parked and seemingly untouched. Investigators initially looked at Danny as a potential suspect. They always look at the romantic partner first in missing persons cases. Christy and Danny had gotten into a domestic dispute back in April. Nothing serious, but enough to raise questions. Yet the more they investigated Danny, the more he appeared to be what he claimed, a worried boyfriend who just wanted his girlfriend to come home safely. So investigators turned their attention to Thunder Valley Casino. They pulled surveillance footage and began the painstaking process of tracking Christy's movements throughout the evening. That's when they spotted the man who kept appearing beside her hour after hour. Using the casino's player card system, they identified him Mario Flavio Garcia, a resident of Auburn, California. On October 7th, detectives went to Garcia's home to interview him. When Garcia answered the door, investigators immediately noticed something. His face was covered in scratches, fresh scratches, deep ones that ran down his face and across his chest. They looked like defensive wounds, the kind that comes from someone clawing at an attacker fighting for their life. Garcia seemed nervous, but agreed to talk. He admitted he'd been at Thunder Valley Casino that night. Yes, he remembered meeting a young woman. They'd gambled together for a while, he said. He couldn't remember her name. When they left the casino together around 1 in the morning, they'd walked toward his car in the parking lot. But then, Garcia claimed, Christy told him she'd lost her phone. She said she needed to go back inside the casino to find it. They said goodbye, he said, and she walked back toward the casino entrance while he got in his car and drove home alone. Garcia said he'd turned left out of the parking lot, taking the most direct route back to Auburn. He'd gotten home, gone to bed. That was it. He had no idea what happened to Christy after that. Investigators noted every detail of Garcia's story, but they didn't believe him. The scratches on his face told a different story. The next day, October 6th, Garcia had gone to a doctor, claiming the injuries to his face, chest, and eye came from falling out of a tree while doing yard work. But his injuries weren't consistent with that type of fall. And when Garcia showed up to work that morning, an hour late, coworkers noticed the scratches right away. On October 8th, investigators obtained a search warrant for Garcia's vehicle. What they found confirmed their worst suspicions. Inside the car, forensic technicians discovered strands of hair consistent with Christy Wilson's. They also found minute amounts of blood on the back seat and door. DNA testing would later confirm it was Christy's blood. Christy Wilson had been inside Mario Garcia's car, and she hadn't gotten out on her own. As investigators dug deeper into Mario Garcia's background, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. This was not a man who'd simply made one terrible mistake. This was a man who'd been hurting women for decades, and the system had failed to stop him. The story began in 1976, in the Bay Area city of Fremont, California. A young woman named Wendy Ward had just moved there from Ohio with her husband. They settled into their new neighborhood and quickly befriended their neighbors, including a man named Mario Garcia. He seemed kind, helpful, the perfect neighbor. When Wendy and her husband separated the following year, Garcia was there, offering support and friendship. Wendy was 26. Mario was 27. They started dating. At first, Garcia seemed wonderful, supportive, caring, attentive. Soon, Wendy noticed a shift. Garcia became possessive. His temper would flare without warning. When she tried to pull away, he became more controlling. Wendy began missing work so her colleagues wouldn't see her black eyes. In 1978, when Wendy finally told Garcia she was ending the relationship, he snapped. He grabbed her, forced her into his van, and drove to a secluded area in the Santa Cruz Mountains. What happened there was brutal. Garcia held her by the neck, threatened to smash her head in if she resisted. He sexually assaulted her. Wendy fought back, clawing and scratching, trying desperately to get away. She managed to escape with her life, but barely. Police arrested Garcia, and he was charged with kidnapping, rape, and assault with a deadly weapon. But then months later, in January 1979, Garcia came back for Wendy. He kidnapped her again. This time he brought her to a room where he showed her a pistol. He loaded a magazine, approached her, and pressed the gun to her head. Wendy heard the click of the hammer. The gun wasn't loaded. Garcia was toying with her, terrorizing her. He asked her if she'd ever considered suicide. Somehow Wendy survived that night too. Garcia was arrested again, but the case dragged through the courts for 2 years. In 1981, prosecutors, overwhelmed with cases, courts clogged with backlogs, offered Garcia a plea deal. They told Wendy it was her word against his, that they might not win at trial. The deal: Garcia would plead guilty to 1 count of assault with a deadly weapon. His sentence, 18 months of probation. Wendy took the deal. She had to. But she knew in her heart that Garcia would do this again. She tried to move on with her life, hoping she'd never hear his name again. But while Garcia was out on bail in 1979, waiting for his case to be resolved, he met a woman named Lynette Smith. She was 33 years old, vivacious and athletic, known for her love of dancing. Lynette worked as a legal secretary on Garcia's defense team. Garcia told her that Wendy Ward was unstable, that she'd fabricated the charges against him. Lynette believed him. They started dating. They moved in together. And then the abuse began. The same pattern Wendy had endured. The physical violence, the control, the terror. On one occasion, the abuse was so severe that Lynette had to be hospitalized. Her brother, Tom Davis, watched helplessly as his sister fell into the same nightmare Wendy had escaped. By the end of 1979, Lynette had reached her breaking point. She called her mother, Violet Davis, in Ohio and begged her to fly out to California. She needed support to end the relationship with Garcia. Her mother came. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1979, Garcia suggested they all go out for dinner, as a way of getting closure. Lynette, her mother, Violet, and Garcia drove from Hayward to a restaurant in San Francisco in Lynette's beige 4-door sedan. After dinner, they began the drive back home. Eyewitnesses on Doolittle Road near Oakland International Airport reported seeing a car suddenly accelerate to 90 miles per hour. It crossed 2 lanes of traffic and plunged into the Oakland estuary. Multiple motorists watched in horror as the car sank into the water. Mario Garcia emerged from the roof of the car. Witnesses said he climbed out and waited on top of the vehicle until it completely disappeared beneath the surface. Then he swam calmly toward shore. Lynette Smith and her mother Violet Davis drowned in that car. Oakland police investigated the incident. Garcia's story kept changing. He gave conflicting accounts about where he was sitting in the car, about what happened in those final moments. Lynette's brother Tom told police that his sister was an excellent swimmer. The idea that she couldn't escape that car made no sense. But there was no physical evidence to prove Garcia had been driving. No way to demonstrate that this wasn't just a tragic accident. The case went cold. Officially, it remains unsolved to this day. Wendy Ward found out about Lynette's death through a heartbreaking coincidence. Tom Davis was an old friend from Ohio. When Wendy reconnected with him and asked about his sister, Tom told her Lynette had died in a car accident. The man involved, Mario Garcia. Wendy felt sick. She knew, deep in her soul, that Garcia had been behind that wheel, that he'd murdered Lynette and her mother just like he'd tried to murder her. But Garcia walked away. Again. He eventually married a woman named Jean. They had 2 sons together. Garcia got a job in IT, worked his way up to project manager at Sutter Health. He coached soccer. His neighbors and co-workers thought he was a great guy, a devoted father, an upstanding member of the community. No one knew about the dead women in his past. No one knew about the darkness he carried inside him. Until October 5th, 2005, when that darkness consumed Christy Wilson. On October 27th, 2005, 3 weeks after Christy disappeared, the Placer County District Attorney's Office made an unprecedented decision. They charged Mario Garcia with the murder of Christy Wilson, even though her body had not been found. This was Placer County's first no-body homicide case. It was a massive risk. Without a body, without a definitive crime scene, could they prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Christy was dead and that Garcia had killed her? The evidence was circumstantial. Christy's hair and blood in Garcia's car, his scratches on his face, his shifting stories, his violent past. Would it be enough? For Debbie Boyd, Christy's mother, the arrest brought both relief and terror. She was glad Garcia was in custody, unable to hurt anyone else. But she was terrified that he might get away with it, that the case would fall apart, that her daughter's killer would walk free. The thought of him getting off on this case once again scares the living daylights out of me for every woman, Debbie said. Debbie Boyd was 5'1", blonde, soft-spoken. But beneath that gentle exterior was a mother's fierce determination. From the moment Christy disappeared, Debbie made a vow she would not rest until she found out what happened to her daughter, until she brought Christy home. I want my daughter back, and I want her back now, Debbie told reporters in those early days. I may be 5'1" and blonde, but they just met a barracuda, and the fight's on. The trial began on September 11, 2006, almost a year after Christy's disappearance. For 2 months, the prosecution presented their case to the jury. 90 witnesses testified. The surveillance footage from the casino was shown, again and again. Christy and Garcia leaving together, Garcia trying to put his arm around her, Christy pushing him away. Garcia's car leaving the parking lot, apparently empty. Karen Horst, the deputy district attorney prosecuting the case, laid out what he believed happened. She went out of the casino with the defendant. At some point in the vehicle in the casino parking lot, he incapacitated her. He was probably putting her in the back seat so that when he drove away, nobody could see. Forensic experts testified about the blood and hair found in Garcia's car. Christy's DNA was there. She had been in that vehicle. Medical experts examined the scratches on Garcia's face and chest. They were consistent with defensive wounds, the kind that comes from fingernails clawing at an attacker. Wendy Ward took the stand. She told the jury about what Garcia had done to her 27 years earlier. The kidnapping, the rape, the gun to her head. She described how Garcia had terrorized her, how she'd barely escaped with her life. She looked directly at Mario Garcia and told her truth. Tom Davis testified about his sister Lynette and what happened on that Christmas Eve in 1979. About how his sister and mother had drowned in a car with Mario Garcia behind the wheel. Garcia's defense attorney argued that there wasn't enough evidence to convict, that without a body, there was no proof Christy was even dead. Maybe she'd run away. Maybe she was alive somewhere. But the jury didn't buy it. They saw the pattern. They saw the violence that had followed Mario Garcia throughout his life. They saw a man who hurt women, who controlled them, who killed them when they tried to leave. On November 29th, 2006, after deliberating, the jury returned their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. In the courtroom, Christie's family wept. Debbie Boyd felt a wave of relief wash over her. But it was incomplete. They had justice. Yes. Garcia would go to prison, but Christie was still out there somewhere. Her body was still hidden, still lost. On January 11th, 2007, Mario Garcia stood before the judge for sentencing. Debbie Boyd hoped that Garcia might finally tell them where Christie was, that he might trade the location of her body for a reduced sentence. But when it was Garcia's turn to speak, he was cold and defiant. I suppose that at this hearing, I'm supposed to ask for mercy, for forgiveness, and to show remorse, Garcia said. However, I will not do such thing. I did not kill Christie Wilson. I am innocent. Mario Garcia was sentenced to 59 years to life in prison. He was taken away to serve his sentence at the R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility, near San Diego. His wife, Jean, and his 2 sons severed all ties with him after the conviction, and Christie Wilson remained missing. The years passed slowly for Debbie Boyd. Every night before bed, she wondered the same thing. Where is my daughter? Where did Mario Garcia put her? Investigators Don Murchison and Nuno Tavares refused to give up. They'd been on the case from the beginning, and they were determined to find Christie and bring her home to her family. They searched abandoned mines. They looked in fields and forests. They even searched through sewage-filled septic tanks. Every lead, every tip, every possibility. They followed it all. But Northern California is vast. The Sierra Nevada mountains offer countless places to hide a body. Rivers, lakes, forests, ravines. Christie could be anywhere. In 2017, Debbie Boyd made a painful decision. She reached out to Mario Garcia. In a television interview, she called him a lost soul, and hinted that she'd be willing to sit down and talk with him. She wanted Christie back so desperately that she was willing to negotiate with her daughter's murderer. Her appeal worked. Garcia began writing letters to Boyd, and to Placer County officials. He never admitted to killing Christie, but he apologized to Boyd for her loss. In one letter, Garcia hinted that he might be willing to trade information for an early release from prison. I would give anything if I could go home to die surrounded by my family, he wrote. For a moment, it seemed like Debbie might finally get her answer. But as she thought about it, she realized she couldn't do it. She couldn't let Garcia use her daughter's body as a bargaining chip. She couldn't give him what he wanted. Freedom when he'd taken everything from Christie. This would be such a disgrace, Debbie said. He will not use my daughter's body as a bargaining chip. So the search continued. More years passed. 2017 became 2018. Then 2019. 15 years since Christie had disappeared. 15 years of searching. 15 years of not knowing. Then, in 2019, investigators Murchison and Tavares decided to try something different. They contacted Garcia's 2 sons, who had been teenagers back in 2005. The investigators asked if the sons remembered anything unusual about their father's behavior in the days after Christie disappeared. One of the sons remembered something. It was a small detail, something that had stuck with him for years. He recalled seeing his father using a tractor in their backyard around the time Christie vanished. The memory had always bothered him because his father was supposed to be at one of his soccer games that day. It was important, and his father had promised to be there. But instead, Garcia had stayed home, working in the backyard with the tractor. It was strange. It was out of character, and it had happened at exactly the same time Christie Wilson disappeared. Murchison and Tavares looked at each other. Garcia's former home in Auburn. The property was large, 4.5 acres. Could it be? The house had been sold years ago. New owners lived there now, but when investigators approached them and explained the situation, the homeowners agreed to let them search the property. In August 2020, nearly 15 years after Christie disappeared, a team of investigators arrived at the Auburn property with ground-penetrating radar equipment. They began scanning the vast yard, section by section, looking for any anomaly in the soil, any disturbance that might indicate something or someone had been buried there. The radar picked up several areas of interest. The team began excavating, carefully digging in each location. The first hole yielded nothing. The second hole, nothing. At the third location, just 100 yards from the house where Garcia had lived with his wife and sons, an investigator saw something, a bone, poking up from the earth. They'd found her. Over the following hours, investigators carefully excavated the area. They recovered skeletal remains, nearly a complete skeleton. The remains were brought to the Placer County morgue for examination. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. It was Christy Wilson. She'd been there all along, buried in the backyard of Garcia's home while his family lived their lives. While his sons played soccer and did homework, while Garcia went to work and coached and pretended to be a normal man, Christy had been right there. An autopsy revealed that Christy had suffered a broken nose and a broken hand injuries consistent with a struggle, with her fighting desperately for her life. But after 15 years, her remains were too decomposed to determine an exact cause of death. On August 24, 2020, the Placer County Sheriff's Office held a press conference to announce that Christy Wilson had been found. Debbie Boyd stood before the cameras, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'm very, very grateful," she said. She thanked the investigators who'd never given up, who'd searched for 15 years to bring her daughter home. After so long, so many nights of wondering, so many prayers, so many tears, Christy could finally rest. Christy's family had her remains cremated. They visited a pier in Capitola where they'd placed a memorial plaque years earlier, a place Christy had loved to go. They scattered some of her ashes there, letting her be part of the ocean, the waves, the endless horizon. Debbie Boyd said that finally knowing where Christy was, finally having her home, allowed the family to grieve in a way they couldn't before. The wondering had been unbearable. Now at least they had closure. Not the closure they wanted. Christy should have been alive, should have had a family of her own, should have grown old, but closure nonetheless. Mario Garcia died on December 24th, 2020, just 4 months after Christy's body was found. He died of pneumonia on Christmas Eve, exactly 41 years to the day after Lynette Smith and Violet Davis drowned in that car in Oakland. He died without ever admitting what he'd done, without ever showing remorse, without ever explaining why. In the end, Christy Wilson helped solve her own murder. Scratches she left on Mario Garcia's face and body in those final moments of her life became crucial evidence. Her DNA in his car proved she'd been there, and even 15 years later, her bones confirmed what everyone already knew. Mario Garcia was a killer. Detective Don Murchison, who worked the case from the beginning, reflected on the long search. "We wanted to find her to show Mario, you're not going to win. We're going to find her and bring her home to the family." We never gave up on trying to find Christy. We looked for her for 15 years. Her family certainly never gave up. They trusted us with the most precious thing they had in their lives, which was their daughter. Debbie Boyd's determination, her refusal to let Garcia bargain with her daughter's body, her 15-year fight to bring Christy home, it became a testament to a mother's love, to the unbreakable bond between parent and child. A bond that not even death could sever. Christy Wilson was 27 years old when she died. She was at the beginning of her adult life, full of potential and promise. She'd overcome challenges, earned a job offer in San Francisco, was ready for a fresh start. She'd gone to a casino for a few hours of fun to gamble and unwind, to enjoy herself after a stressful period in her life. She didn't deserve what happened to her. No one does. Her story reminds us that evil often wears a friendly face, that monsters can be neighbors, co-workers, the coach of your child's soccer team, that systems sometimes fail, allowing dangerous people to hurt again and again, that justice, when it comes, can take years or decades to arrive. But it also reminds us of the power of perseverance, of mothers who refuse to give up, of investigators who work a case for 15 years because they made a promise, of families who hold on to hope, even when it seems like there's none left to hold on to. Rest peacefully, Christy Wilson. Your mother brought you home. Your memory endures, and Mario Garcia, the man who thought he'd buried his secret forever, died knowing that his last victim had been found, that his carefully constructed lies had crumbled, that he'd been exposed for exactly what he was. In the end, Christy won. She fought back. She left her mark. She made sure the truth would eventually come to light. And that perhaps is the most important part of her story to remember. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're traveling to the quiet coastal community of West Mersey, a small island town in Essex, England. This is a place where neighbors know each other by name, where local carnivals bring the community together, and where trust runs deep through the fabric of everyday life. But sometimes the most ordinary places hide the most extraordinary darkness. This is the story of Carol and Stephen Baxter, a successful couple in their 60s who built a comfortable life together. And this is also the story of Luke DeWitt, a young man who presented himself as helpful and kind, but who harbored something far more sinister beneath his quiet exterior. What unfolded over nearly a decade remains one of the most complex and disturbing cases ever investigated by Essex police. So, as we settle in, let me tell you about a crime that shocked an entire nation. West Mersey is the kind of place people dream of retiring to. Located on an island connected to mainland Essex by a causeway, it offers stunning views of the Blackwater estuary, charming seafood restaurants, and a tight-knit community where everyone seems to know everyone else. The island has a population of around 7,000 people, and crime is rare here. It's peaceful, safe, or at least it was supposed to be. Carol and Stephen Baxter embodied the island dream. Carol, 64 years old, was a warm and generous woman with an infectious laugh. Stephen, 61, was her devoted husband and business partner. Together, they ran a successful company called Casplash, which manufactured and sold curved bath mats designed specifically for shower and bath safety. It was a niche market, but they built it from the ground up, and by the early 2020s, the business was thriving. The couple had been married since 2000, and their relationship was one of genuine partnership. They worked together, planned together, and dreamed together. They had 2 children, a daughter named Ellie, and a son named Harry. As their children grew up and moved out to start their own lives, Carol and Stephen found themselves entering that golden phase of life where they could finally enjoy the fruits of their labor. They were looking forward to spending more time with their grandchildren, planning holidays, maybe even downsizing to a more manageable home. Their house on Victory Road was a beautiful property, the kind of home that represented everything they'd worked for. It had a conservatory where they loved to sit in their favorite armchairs, looking out at their garden, discussing business plans, or simply enjoying each other's company. Friends described them as devoted to each other, always supporting one another through life's ups and downs. Carol was particularly community-minded. She was involved in local activities, always willing to help a neighbor, always ready with a kind word. Stephen was quieter, more reserved, but equally generous. Together, they were pillars of the West Mersey community. They were the kind of people everyone wanted to know, the kind who made their corner of the world a little bit brighter. But around 2012, the Baxters needed help with something outside their expertise. Their business was growing, and they needed a proper website, something professional that could help them reach more customers. They needed someone who understood technology, someone who could navigate the digital world that was increasingly important for small businesses. That's when Luke DeWitt entered their lives. Luke DeWitt was in his mid-20s when he first met the Baxters. He was introduced through a mutual acquaintance, and he seemed like the perfect solution to their problem. He was an IT consultant, someone who could build their website and help them manage the technical side of their growing business. And from the very beginning, Luke seemed eager to help. Luke was a quiet young man, what some people might call a bit odd or nerdy. He lived with his mother in West Mersey, and he kept to himself mostly, but he had a good reputation in the community. He volunteered at the local soup kitchen. He helped organize the annual Mersey Carnival. He was always willing to lend a hand when someone needed technical help with their computer or phone. To everyone who knew him, Luke Deadwood was harmless, helpful, kind. The Baxters welcomed him into their world. He built their website, and he did a good job, so they asked him to help with other aspects of the business. Soon, Luke was coming to their house several times a week, helping with various tasks, becoming more involved in the day-to-day operations of Cosplash. He had access to their home office, their computers, their business record, but more than that, Luke became part of their lives. He would stay for meals. He'd chat with Carol about her day. He'd discuss business strategies with Stephen. According to their daughter Ellie, Carol and Stephen started to see Luke as almost like a third child. They felt sorry for him, this quiet young man who seemed lonely. When Luke's father died, they made even more of an effort to include him, to make sure he felt supported and cared for. They just decided he was lonely, Ellie would later recall. They took him under their wing and would let him join in. Luke became a fixture at the house on Victory Road. He knew the security code to their front gate. He knew where they kept their spare key. He could come and go almost as if he lived there. And Carol and Stephen trusted him completely. But trust, as it turns out, can be a dangerous thing. Around 2020, Carol began experiencing troubling health problems. She was feeling exhausted all the time, struggling with brain fog, experiencing mood swings. At first, she attributed it to stress or perhaps early menopause. But the symptoms persisted and worsened. She went to her doctor, underwent tests, and eventually received a diagnosis: Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disorder that affects the thyroid gland. It's relatively common, especially in women, and while it can be challenging to manage, it's treatable with proper medical care. Carol started on medication and began researching her condition, trying to understand what she was dealing with. But something strange started happening. Despite following her doctor's advice, despite taking her medication, Carol's condition didn't improve. In fact, it seemed to get worse. She became increasingly forgetful, to the point where her family worried she might be developing early-onset dementia. Her behavior became erratic and unpredictable. There were times when she seemed confused, disoriented, not quite herself. The family was deeply worried. Stephen did everything he could to support his wife. Ellie tried to encourage her mother to see more doctors, to get second opinions. But Carol was becoming increasingly isolated, increasingly dependent on a very specific source of support. That support came in the form of an American doctor named Andrea Bowden. Dr. Andrea Bowden, according to her online presence, was a specialist in endocrinology with particular expertise in treating Hashimoto's disease. She had supposedly treated dozens of patients successfully, helping them manage their symptoms and reclaim their lives. And somehow she had reached out to Carol, offering to help. Carol was thrilled. Finally, someone who understood what she was going through. Dr. Bowden seemed compassionate, knowledgeable, and genuinely invested in Carol's well-being. She invited Carol to join a private WhatsApp support group for Hashimoto's patients. In this group, Carol found what seemed like a community of understanding, other women who were going through exactly what she was experiencing. There was Cheryl, who had struggled with Hashimoto's for years but was finally seeing improvement. There was Jenny, Cheryl's sister, who was supportive and kind. There was Linda Edwards, another patient who shared her experiences and offered encouragement. These women became Carol's confidants, her support system, the people she turned to when she felt lost and confused. Dr. Bowden began offering Carol specific medical advice. She suggested Carol drink hot water with lemon and aspirin to improve her liver health. She recommended special supplements and smoothies that would help manage her symptoms. She advised Carol to ignore some of her regular doctor's recommendations, suggesting they didn't truly understand Hashimoto's the way Dr. Bowden did. And Carol listened. She trusted Dr. Bowden, implicitly. After all, this was a doctor who specialized in exactly what Carol was dealing with. This was someone who had helped so many others. Why wouldn't she follow her advice? Luke DeWitt, ever helpful, stepped in to assist. He offered to make the special smoothies Dr. Bowden recommended. He helped Carol manage her medication, making sure she took the right pills at the right times. He visited every single day, bringing his special health drinks, checking on Carol's progress, documenting her symptoms to share with Dr. Bowden. Carol's family noticed that Luke's presence in their lives was becoming more intensive. He was always there, always hovering, Ellie later described it as nerdy weird, the way he was constantly around. But Carol insisted Luke was helping. He was the one who made sure she took her supplements. He was the one who communicated with Dr. Bowden on her behalf. He was, Carol believed, one of the few people truly trying to help her get better. But Carol wasn't getting better. She was getting worse. What Carol didn't know, what no one in the Baxter family knew, was that Dr. Andrea Bowden didn't exist. Neither did Cheryl, or Jenny, or Linda Edwards, or any of the other supportive members of that WhatsApp group. Every single one of them was a fabrication, a fictional character created and controlled by one person, Luke DeWitt. Over the course of several years, Luke had created more than 20 distinct online personas. He had given each one a detailed backstory, a unique personality, a specific way of writing and communicating. He had created email accounts, WhatsApp profiles, even recorded voice messages using different voices to make these characters seem real. The attention to detail was extraordinary. He would have these fake personas interact with each other, creating the illusion of a genuine support network. He would send messages from Dr. Bowden giving medical advice, then have Cheryl respond with how that same advice had helped her. He would create conflicts and resolutions between the characters, making them seem like real people with real lives and real problems. Why would someone do this? What could possibly motivate such an elaborate, time-consuming deception? The answer was control. Luke DeWitt was systematically isolating Carol from her real support system. Through Dr. Bowden, he convinced Carol to ignore her actual doctor's advice. Through the support group members, he made Carol feel that her family didn't understand what she was going through. He positioned himself as the bridge between Carol and this community that supposedly understood her, making himself indispensable to her daily life. And those smoothies he was making, those special health drinks recommended by Dr. Bowden, they weren't helping Carol at all. They were poisoning her. Luke was secretly adding various drugs to Carol's smoothies. He was giving her quadruple doses of promethazine, an antihistamine that would cause drowsiness, confusion, and impaired cognitive function. He was creating the very symptoms that made Carol feel she needed more help from Doc Bowden, creating a vicious cycle of dependence. In one particularly disturbing incident, Carol was hospitalized with severe stomach pain. During a scan, doctors discovered something shocking. There was a metal tack inside a medicine capsule in her stomach. Someone had deliberately placed a sharp metal object inside what appeared to be a normal pill. The doctors managed to remove the tack, but Carol had no idea how it had gotten there. It was a mystery, a frightening incident that added to her growing sense that something was terribly wrong with her body. When police would later search Luke's home, they would find a bag containing metal tacks identical to the one that had been removed from Carol's stomach. They would also find empty pill casings, the kind that could be filled with medications or other substances. Luke DeWitt wasn't just manipulating Carol's mind, he was actively harming her body, slowly poisoning her, watching her deteriorate, all while presenting himself as her devoted helper. But why? What was the endgame? By early 2023, Carol's condition had become critical. She was confused most of the time, barely able to function. Her family was desperate, watching someone they loved slip away and not understanding why. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. The medications weren't working. Carol felt completely alone, trapped in a body and mind that seemed to be betraying her. Luke DeWitt was spending more time at the Baxter house than ever before. He was there every single day, managing Carol's medications, making her smoothies, checking on both Carol and Stephen. The family was grateful for his help, even if his constant presence felt a bit overwhelming at times. What no one knew was that Luke was preparing for the final phase of his plan. At some point, the exact timeline is unclear. Luke had begun thinking about what would happen to Casplash if something happened to Carol and Stephen. He had worked for the company for years. He knew the business inside and out. He had helped build their digital presence, managed their website, assisted with technical aspects of operations. In his mind, he deserved a stake in the company. But Carol and Stephen had their own plans for their business. They had created a will, properly drawn up by solicitors, that left everything to their children, Ellie and Harry. This was their legacy, something they wanted to pass on to the next generation. Luke decided to change that. Through one of his fake personas, a solicitor named Martin Ellison, Luke began planting seeds about the importance of updating wills, of making sure business succession plans were in place. He created a new document, one that looked official and legitimate, that designated Luke DeWitt as a director and person with significant control of Casplash. According to this false will, if anything happened to Carol and Stephen, Ellie would inherit the business, but Luke would be named director. And when Ellie turned 30, Luke would automatically receive 50% ownership of the company. Moreover, Ellie would have no authority to remove him from his position. It was an audacious plan. It was also, Luke believed, foolproof. After all, he had spent years building trust with this family. He was like a son to them. Why would anyone question a will that provided for their devoted friend and employee? But a new will wasn't enough. For Luke's plan to work, Carol and Stephen Baxter needed to die, and Luke DeWitt had already decided exactly how that would happen. The spring of 2023 arrived wet and cold in West Mercy. Easter fell early that year, with Good Friday landing on April 7th. It should have been a time of renewal, of family gatherings, of hope. Instead, it would mark the beginning of the end for Carol and Stephen Baxter. Luke DeWitt arrived at the Baxter house on the morning of Good Friday at 10:20 a.m. He came bearing his usual items: smoothies for Carol, medications to help manage her symptoms, his laptop in case any technical work needed to be done. To anyone watching, it was just another normal visit from the helpful young man who had become such a fixture in the Baxters' lives. But this visit was different. The smoothies Luke brought that morning contained something new, something deadly: fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid used in medical settings to treat severe pain. It's incredibly potent, up to 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. A tiny amount can be therapeutic when properly administered by medical professionals, but just slightly more can be fatal. Luke had obtained fentanyl patches, the kind that are prescribed for chronic pain management. He claimed they had belonged to his late father, though he would later change his story to say they belonged to his grandfather. However he obtained them, Luke had carefully extracted the fentanyl from the patches, crushed it into a powder, and mixed it into the special drinks he prepared for Carol and Stephen. The Baxters had no idea what they were consuming. They trusted Luke completely. When he handed them their smoothies that morning, telling them it was a special recipe that Dr. Bowden had recommended, they drank them without hesitation, and then Luke waited. He didn't leave the house. He stayed there, his phone in his hand, watching, because Luke had taken one more precaution to ensure his plan would work. He had installed a mobile surveillance camera in the Baxters' conservatory, the room where they spent most of their time, sitting in their favorite armchairs. He had connected this camera to an app on his phone, allowing him to monitor them in real time. As the fentanyl began to take effect, Carol and Stephen would have started feeling drowsy. Perhaps they thought they were just tired, needing an afternoon nap. They settled into their armchairs in the conservatory, the place where they'd spent countless peaceful hours together. The fentanyl worked quickly. Within hours, both Carol and Stephen Baxter slipped into unconsciousness. Their breathing would have become shallow, then slower, then stopped altogether. It would have been, if there's any mercy in this at all, relatively peaceful. They likely had no idea what was happening. They simply fell asleep, sitting side by side in the conservatory they loved, and never woke up. Luke DeWitt watched it all happen on his phone. He stayed in the house until 7:55 that evening, monitoring them, making sure the poison had done its work. When he was certain they were dead, he finally left, carefully locking the front door behind him with a double lock. The doorbell camera captured him leaving, walking down the path from the house. His eyes on his phone, his expression calm and composed. He walked back to his own house, settled in for the evening, and watched a crime drama on television called Beyond Paradise. The next day, Saturday, April 8th, Luke went out for breakfast with his mother. They had ice cream together. It was a pleasant day, a normal day. Meanwhile, just a short distance away, Carol and Stephen Baxter sat dead in their conservatory, their bodies growing cold in their favorite chairs. Luke didn't check on them. He didn't call. He simply waited for someone else to discover what he had done. Easter Sunday, April 9th, 2023, dawned over West Mercy. It should have been a day of celebration, of family gatherings, of hope and renewal. Instead, it became the day that changed everything for the Baxter family forever. Ellie Baxter was concerned. She had been trying to reach her parents all weekend, but they weren't answering their phones. This was unusual, especially on Easter weekend. Her parents always answered when she called. Always. By mid-morning, Ellie's concern had turned to worry. She decided to drive over to her parents' house to check on them. When she arrived at Victory Road, she knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She looked for the spare key, but it wasn't in its usual place. Something felt wrong. Ellie walked around to the conservatory, the room where her parents spent so much of their time, and that's when she saw them, through the window. Her mother and father sitting in their armchairs, completely still. Carol had some kind of substance coming from her mouth. Ellie began pounding on the windows, screaming for her parents to wake up. When they didn't respond, she called her partner, and together they smashed their way into the house. Ellie ran to her parents, trying desperately to wake them, but it was too late. They were cold to the touch. They were gone. I have never known an emotional pain to physically hurt so much. Ellie would later say, describing that moment, "I begged them to wake up. The police and paramedics arrived quickly. They found a scene that was both tragic and puzzling. Here were two people in their 60s, apparently healthy, now dead in their home with no obvious injuries, no signs of violence, no clear indication of what had happened." While the emergency responders were still on scene, Luke DeWitt arrived. He approached an officer, presenting himself as a close family friend. He suggested that maybe it was a gas leak, carbon monoxide poisoning perhaps. He seemed concerned, helpful, eager to assist in any way he could. A police officer's body camera captured Luke that day, standing outside the Baxter house, speaking calmly about his friends. "I need to check on them," he said. "I always pop in." He explained that he had worked for the Baxters, that he helped Carol with her medication, that he was like family to them. To the officers on scene, Luke DeWitt appeared to be a grieving friend, shocked by the sudden loss of people he cared about. They had no reason to suspect he was anything else. In fact, initially Luke was treated as a witness, someone who might be able to help them understand what had happened to Carol and Stephen. The house was examined for carbon monoxide, but the levels were normal. There was no gas leak. The heating system was functioning properly. So what had killed them? The bodies were taken to Broomfield Hospital for post-mortem examinations. It would be weeks before the toxicology reports came back, weeks during which the Baxter family tried to process their grief, tried to understand how they could have lost both parents on the same day, tried to plan funerals for two people who should have had many more years ahead of them. And during those weeks, Luke DeWitt did something extraordinary in its audacity. He produced a will, the day after the Baxters' bodies were found. Luke DeWitt sat down with his phone and created a document. He titled it as The Last Will and Testament of Carol and Stephen Baxter. In this document, he outlined how, in the event of their deaths, Cowsplash Limited should be managed. He made himself a director and gave himself significant control over the company. He specified that upon Ellie turning 30, he would own 50% of the business. He backdated this document to early 2023, making it appear as though the Baxters had created it months before their deaths. Then he placed a copy of this will in the Baxter house, in a location where Ellie would be sure to find it as she went through her parents' belongings. Ellie was confused when she found the will. Her parents had never mentioned creating a new will. They had always been transparent about their plans to leave the business to their children. This new document didn't make sense. She mentioned it to the police, who made a note of it but didn't initially see it as significant. Then, in July of 2023, the toxicology reports finally came back, and everything changed. Both Carol and Stephen Baxter had died from lethal doses of fentanyl. The amounts in their systems were massive, enough to kill each of them several times over. This wasn't an accidental overdose. This wasn't a suicide, this was murder. Essex police immediately launched a murder investigation. Detective Inspector Lydia George was assigned as the senior investigating officer. She assembled a team of detectives, digital forensics experts, and analysts to begin piecing together what had happened in that house on Victory Road. The investigation started with the basics. Who had access to the Baxters? Who had been in contact with them in the days before their deaths? Who stood to benefit from their deaths? The doorbell camera footage quickly revealed that Luke DeWitt had been the last person to visit Carol and Stephen before they died. He had arrived on the morning of Good Friday, and hadn't left until nearly 8 p.m. that evening, and after he left there was no evidence of anyone else entering the house until Ellie discovered the bodies on Easter Sunday. The suspicious will raised red flags. When police checked with the Baxters' actual solicitors, they found a completely different will on file, one that left everything to Ellie and Harry with no mention of Luke DeWitt at all. A search warrant was executed on Luke's home in July. What the police found there was shocking. There were 80 electronic devices, 80 phones, laptops, tablets, USB drives, hard drives. It was a staggering collection of technology for one person to possess. And then there were the fentanyl patches. Multiple patches, some used, some unused. Luke claimed they had belonged to his father, who had been prescribed them for pain management before his death. Later, when that story didn't hold up, he changed it to say they had belonged to his grandfather. But the most damning evidence was found in a bag in Luke's bedroom. Inside that bag were metal tacks, identical to the one that had been removed from Carol Baxter's stomach months earlier. There were also empty pill casings and prepared capsules containing quadruple doses of promethazine. Detective Superintendent Rob Kirby would later say that finding these items suggested Luke had been planning to kill again. The fact that he still had the murder weapons, that he had prepared additional poison pills, indicated he wasn't done. If he hadn't been caught, there likely would have been more victims. But the most revealing evidence was digital. When Detective Reuben Brame and his team began examining the 80 devices seized from Luke DeWitt's home, they uncovered a network of deception that was almost unbelievable in its scope and complexity. Every single fake persona that had been communicating with Carol Baxter traced back to Luke, Dr. Andrea Bowden, Cheryl, Jenny, Linda Edwards, all the supportive members of the Hashimoto's support group, all the email addresses, WhatsApp accounts, social media profiles. All of it was Luke. The investigators found evidence of the painstaking work Luke had put into maintaining these personas. He had created detailed backstories for each character. He had practiced speaking in different voices, recording audio messages to make Jenny sound different from Dr. Bowden. He had carefully crafted the writing style of each character to make them seem distinct from one another. But here's what proved beyond any doubt that these weren't real people. The investigators found messages between these fake personas and Stephen Baxter. Luke had tried to claim in his defense that Stephen had been in on the scheme, that they had created these fake personas together to help Carol feel supported. But the messages showed conversations between Stephen and Dr. Alban, between Stephen and Jenny, discussions where Stephen was clearly being deceived by these fictional characters just as much as Carol was. There was no way Stephen could have been creating messages from characters who were actively deceiving him. The surveillance app was still on Luke's phone, the one he had used to watch Carol and Stephen die. The digital forensics team was able to recover evidence that Luke had been monitoring the camera feed during the hours when the fentanyl was taking effect. They also found something particularly chilling. Luke had photos on his phone of Carol and Stephen dead in their armchairs. He had taken pictures of what he had done. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Luke had isolated Carol from her real support system. Through Dr. Bowden, he had convinced Carol that her actual doctors didn't understand Hashimoto's. Through the fake support group, he had made Carol feel that her family didn't understand what she was going through. He had even suggested, through Dr. Bowden, that Carol's phone should be taken away because it was stressing her out, further cutting her off from outside contact. Detective Inspector Lydia George described it as one of the most complex investigations Essex police had ever undertaken. The sheer volume of digital evidence was overwhelming, but piece by piece, the team built an irrefutable case. On July 6, 2023, Luke DeWitt was arrested at his workplace on the University of Essex campus in Colchester. He was charged with 2 counts of murder. His reaction was described as preternaturally calm, while Ellie Baxter, who was also initially suspected and questioned, was distraught and confused. Luke showed no emotion whatsoever. He simply cooperated quietly, offering his explanations, maintaining his composure. The trial would begin in February of 2024. The trial of Luke DeWitt opened at Chelmsford Crown Court on Valentine's Day, 2024. Presiding over the case was Justice Lavender. The prosecution was led by Tracy Eiling, KC, who had the massive task of presenting the complex web of evidence to the jury. Over the course of 6 weeks, the courtroom heard testimony that painted a picture of manipulation and control that was almost unprecedented in its scope. Ellie Baxter took the stand, her voice breaking as she described finding her parents dead. She spoke about how Luke had been a constant presence in their lives, someone she had trusted like a brother. She talked about how she had confided in Jenny, one of Luke's fake personas, after her parents died, seeking comfort from someone she thought understood her pain. "I was absolutely beside myself," Ellie testified. Who do I trust now? I was hurt. Luke I honestly thought was my brother, but unfortunately the evidence is stacking up. It all makes sense now. Medical experts testified about the effects of fentanyl, explaining how the doses found in Carol and Stephen's systems were massively beyond therapeutic levels. They explained how fentanyl shuts down the respiratory system, causing death by essentially making the body forget to breathe. Other medical experts discussed the promethazine found in Carol's system, the quadruple doses that would have caused severe confusion, drowsiness, and cognitive impairment. They explained how Carol's symptoms of supposed dementia were actually the result of being systematically poisoned. Digital forensics experts walked the jury through the evidence recovered from Luke's devices. They showed how every fake persona could be traced back to him. They demonstrated the surveillance app and explained how it had been used to monitor the Baxters as they died. The prosecution played recordings of voice messages Luke had sent while pretending to be Jenny, showing how he had practiced speaking in a feminine voice to make the character more believable. It was disturbing to hear this evidence of the lengths Luke had gone to in his deception. Throughout all of this testimony, Luke DeWitt sat in the dock, using a wheelchair throughout the trial, showing little emotion. He maintained his composure, occasionally taking notes, but never displaying the grief or remorse one might expect from someone accused of murdering their friends. When it came time for the defense, Luke's legal team presented his version of events. Luke claimed that he had created the fake personas. Yes, but that it had been Stephen's idea. According to Luke, Stephen had asked him to create these fictional characters to give Carol someone to talk to help manage her anxiety and stress about her illness. He claimed that he and Stephen had been working together the whole time, that Dr. Bowden and the others were a kind of therapeutic fiction designed to help Carol feel supported. It was. The prosecution argued an absurd defense, and under cross-examination, it fell apart completely. Tracy Eiling read aloud messages between the fictional characters and Stephen Baxter. She showed conversations where Stephen was clearly being manipulated by Dr. Bowden, where he was seeking advice for Carol from this fictional doctor, where he was worried and confused about the conflicting medical information he was receiving. There was no way Stephen could have been part of creating personas that were actively deceiving him. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. On March 20th, 2024, they returned with their verdict, guilty on both counts of murder. Ellie Baxter wept as the verdicts were read. Her brother Harry sat beside her, both of them finally seeing justice for their parents. Luke DeWitt showed no reaction, his expression remaining blank and calm. 2 days later, on March 22, 2024, Luke DeWitt returned to Chelmsford Crown Court for sentencing. Justice Lavender had the difficult task of determining what punishment fit crimes of such calculated cruelty. Before passing sentence, the judge addressed Luke directly, speaking about the nature of his crimes and what they revealed about his character. Justice Lavender spoke about the elaborate planning that had gone into the murders, the years of grooming and manipulation, the creation of more than 20 fake personas, the systematic poisoning of Carol, the surveillance camera set up to watch them die, the fake will created to profit from their deaths. Deciding whether another person lives or dies is the ultimate form of control, Justice Lavender said. He noted that while financial gain was certainly a motive, what seemed to drive Luke more than anything was this desire for control over the Baxters' lives and deaths. The judge described the crimes as macabre and based on a significant degree of planning. He spoke about how Luke had betrayed the trust of people who had welcomed him into their lives, who had treated him like family, who had tried to support him after his own father's death. Ellie Baxter read a victim impact statement to the court. Her words were powerful and heartbreaking. "My mom and dad are dead," she said. "But they didn't just die, they were taken from me and my young children. My mom lost her freedom, her will, her ability to function 2 years prior to her murder, due to her illness. An illness no one could help with or understand because it was contrived by Luke DeWitt." She described how her mother had felt so alone, how Carol had cried on her shoulder, how she had tried desperately to help but didn't understand that her mother was being poisoned. She spoke about finding her parents dead, about the physical pain of that emotional trauma. "Mom felt so alone and lost, and there was nothing I could do other than give her my shoulder to cry on and cuddle her," Ellie said through tears. Justice Lavender then pronounced sentence. Life imprisonment was mandatory for murder. The question was how long Luke would serve. before becoming eligible for parole. The prosecution had argued that the crimes were so serious, so heinous, that Luke should never be released. They suggested a whole life order, meaning Luke DeWitt would die in prison with no possibility of ever being freed. Justice Lavender determined that while the crimes were extraordinarily serious, they didn't quite meet the threshold for a whole life order. Instead, he sentenced Luke DeWitt to life in prison with a minimum term of 37 years before he could even be considered for parole. Luke DeWitt was 26 years old at the time of sentencing. He would be 63 before he could even apply for parole, older than his victims were when he killed them. And parole is far from guaranteed. The parole board would have to be convinced he was no longer a danger to society. Given the calculated nature of his crimes, that seems unlikely. As the sentence was read, Luke showed no emotion. He was led from the dock and taken into custody, beginning what would likely be the rest of his natural life behind bars. The case of Carol and Stephen Baxter raises profound questions about trust, manipulation, and the nature of evil itself. How could someone spend years pretending to care for people, only to methodically plan their murders? What kind of mind creates an entire fictional universe just to isolate and control another human being? Detective Superintendent Rob Kirby, who oversaw the investigation, called it one of the most complex and disturbing cases he had encountered in his career. The sheer effort Luke put into his deception, the hundreds of messages sent while pretending to be different people, the voice recordings, the careful construction of backstories, all of it suggested someone with an almost pathological need for control. Psychologists who reviewed the case noted characteristics consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, and possibly psychopathy. Luke showed no genuine empathy for his victims. He was able to watch them die with clinical detachment. He took photographs of their bodies. He went out for ice cream the next day. But perhaps most chilling was how normal he seemed. Luke DeWitt wasn't an obvious monster. He was quiet, helpful, community-minded. He volunteered at soup kitchens. He helped organize local events. His neighbors described him as polite and harmless. Even after his arrest, some people in West Mercy struggled to believe he could have done something so terrible. This is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of this case. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a friendly face. Sometimes it offers to help with your website, makes you smoothies, becomes like family. For Ellie Baxter and her brother Harry, the pain of losing their parents is compounded by the betrayal of someone they trusted. Luke wasn't just a family friend. He was someone they confided in, someone they grieved with after his own father's death, someone they considered almost like a brother. Our parents were good to him, Ellie said after the sentencing. They trusted him, and he repaid that trust by taking everything from us. The business their parents built, Castle Splash, continues to operate. Ellie has taken over management, determined to preserve her parents' legacy, but the joy has been stolen from it. Every day she runs the business, she's reminded of the person who tried to steal it, and who murdered her parents in the process. West Mercy, that quiet island community where everyone knows everyone, has been forever changed by this case. The sense of safety, of trust, has been shattered. People lock their doors more carefully now. They're more cautious about who they let into their homes, into their lives. Detective Inspector Lydia George reflected on what the investigation revealed about modern technology and its potential for abuse. The ability to create fake personas, to manipulate people through screens and devices, to maintain elaborate deceptions without ever being physically present. These are new dangers in our increasingly digital world. This case shows how technology can be weaponized, she said. Luke DeWitt used every tool available to him to isolate Carol, to make her dependent on him, to ultimately kill her and Stephen. It's a cautionary tale about how we need to be vigilant, even with people we think we know. The question that haunts everyone who followed this case is simple. Why? Why go to such extraordinary lengths? Why spend years building these fake personas? Why not simply walk away if you wanted more control over the business? The truth is, we may never fully understand what drove Luke DeWitt. He has never shown remorse. He has never fully explained himself. Even his defense at trial, blaming Stephen for the fake personas, seemed more like a desperate attempt to avoid conviction than a genuine explanation. Perhaps the answer is that some people are simply wired differently. Some people see others not as human beings with inherent worth. but as objects to be controlled, manipulated, used, and discarded when they're no longer useful. Carol and Stephen Baxter were loving parents, successful business owners, valued members of their community. They worked hard, built a good life, and looked forward to enjoying their golden years together. They welcomed a lonely young man into their lives, trying to show him kindness and support. They deserved to grow old together, to play with their grandchildren, to sit in their conservatory watching the sunset over their garden. Instead, they died in those chairs, poisoned by someone they trusted, someone they had tried to help. This is their story. This is how their lives ended, and how justice was finally served. If you're listening to this as you fall asleep, let it be with the knowledge that cases like this are rare. Most people are good. Most acts of kindness are genuine. Most trust is rewarded with loyalty. But remember, Carol and Stephen. Remember that evil can hide behind a helpful smile. Remember that trust should be earned over time, not given freely to anyone who seems kind. And remember that even in the darkest cases, justice can prevail. The investigators who spent months piecing together this complex puzzle, the prosecutors who presented the evidence, the jury who saw through Luke DeWitt's lies, they all ensured that Carol and Stephen Baxter's deaths were not in vain. Their story has been told. Their memory is preserved. And Luke DeWitt will spend the rest of his life paying for what he did. Rest in peace, Carol and Stephen Baxter. You deserved so much better. Please, if you're still awake, drop a candle. I want to see who's still with me. Also, don't forget to tell me where you're listening from, the time in your corner of the world, and maybe share one thing you've learned from tonight's stories. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Some stories begin with promise and end in tragedy. Some lives shine so brightly that their sudden absence leaves an unfillable void. Tonight's story is about a young woman named Kania Monje, whose dreams of a better life brought her to America, only to have those dreams extinguished by a monster hiding in plain sight. Kania Monje was born on January 26, 1992, in Honduras, to a mother who was little more than a child herself. Maria was only 15 years old when she gave birth to Kania. Life in Honduras was difficult, marked by poverty and limited opportunities. When Maria was just 16, her family made a heart-wrenching decision. They pooled together every resource they had to send Maria to the United States, hoping she could build a foundation for a better future. But there was a cost to this opportunity. Maria had to leave her infant daughter behind with her own mother. For 10 long years, Maria worked tirelessly in America, always thinking of the daughter she'd left behind. In 1994, she met Tony Lee, a man who would become her husband, and eventually the only father Kania would truly know. From the moment they met, Tony heard about Maria's greatest wish, to bring Kania to America. It consumed Maria's thoughts, drove her work ethic, and shaped every decision she made. Finally, in 2004, after a decade of separation, 12-year-old Kania stepped off a plane and into her mother's arms. The reunion was everything Maria had dreamed of. Kania was brought to Aurora, Colorado, where she would live with Maria, Tony, and her 2 younger half-sisters. The family was complete at last. Kania adapted to her new life with remarkable grace. She was small in stature, standing just 4 feet 11 inches tall, but her personality filled every room she entered. She threw herself into learning English, making friends and embracing American culture while still honoring her Honduran roots. When she was 12 and learning English, she asked Tony to explain their relationship in American terms. Tony told her the truth. "I am your stepfather and you are my stepdaughter." But Kania shook her head. "No," she told him firmly. "You are my father and I am your daughter." From that moment on, that's exactly what they were to each other. Kania loved the color pink. She adored Hello Kitty. She dreamed of a career in broadcasting and had enrolled in college to pursue that dream. She had a boyfriend named Leo, with whom she shared an apartment. She was building the life her mother had sacrificed so much to give her. Kania had graduated from high school in June 2010, and by the spring of 2011, she was a vibrant 19-year-old with her whole future ahead of her. March 31st, 2011 was a Thursday night. It was the kind of spring evening when winter's grip had finally loosened and young people felt the pull of downtown Denver's nightlife. Kania made plans to meet up with 2 friends at the 24K Lounge, a trendy nightclub in Denver's lower downtown district. known locally as Lodo. The area was popular with the young crowd, filled with bars, restaurants, and dance clubs packed tightly along historic streets. There was just one problem. Kenya, like many of her friends, was only 19. The legal drinking age in Colorado, as in all of America, was 21. But Kenya, like countless teenagers before and after her, had obtained a fake ID. It was a choice that seemed harmless at the time, a small rebellion that would allow her to enjoy nights out with her friends. She had no way of knowing how fatally consequential this decision would become. That Thursday night, Kenya met her friends at the 24K Lounge. They secured a table and settled in for an evening of dancing and socializing. The music was loud, the lights were dim and colorful, and the atmosphere was electric. For several hours, Kenya and her friends enjoyed themselves. Kenya was drinking, as were her friends, and as the night wore on, she became noticeably intoxicated. At some point in the evening, Kenya excused herself from the table to go to the bathroom. She left her purse behind. She left her cell phone. She left her keys. She simply stood up and walked away from the table, and she never came back. Her friends waited, assuming she'd return any moment. Perhaps she was in line for the bathroom. Perhaps she'd stopped to chat with someone. Minutes turned to half an hour. Half an hour became an hour. Eventually, confused and concerned, but not yet alarmed, her friends gathered Kenya's belongings and left the club. They assumed she must have met someone and left with them, as young people sometimes do. They had no way of knowing they would never see their friend alive again. When Kenya failed to return home that night, her boyfriend Leo became worried. He tried calling her repeatedly, but there was no answer. By morning, he knew something was wrong. Leo contacted Kenya's sister Kim, and together they alerted Maria and Tony. The news hit the parents like a physical blow. Kenya might have been a typical teenager in many ways, but disappearing without a word was completely out of character. She always let someone know where she was. She always answered her phone. Tony and Maria immediately began searching. They called hospitals. They called the police. They retraced what they knew of Kenya's steps. When they met with Kenya's friends and retrieved her purse, phone, and keys, their fear crystallized into something colder and darker. What teenager leaves a club without their phone? Without their keys? Without their purse? Something terrible had happened to their daughter. Tony Lee was a methodical man, and in his desperation, he thought like an investigator. He began combing through Kenya's phone, looking for any clue, any breadcrumb that might lead him to his daughter. And then he found it. A text message that made his blood run cold. The message read, "Hey, this is Travis, the guy who gave you a ride last night. White, creepy van. Did you get home okay?" The casual tone, the smiley face, the reference to a creepy van, said as if it were a joke. It all felt deeply wrong. Tony showed the message to police, who immediately began investigating. They traced the number and identified the sender as a man named Travis Forbes, a 31-year-old local man who worked at a bakery making granola bars. On the surface, Forbes seemed harmless enough. He was an entrepreneur of sorts, selling gluten-free granola bars he made himself. He had a girlfriend named Carrie Humphrey. He seemed like an ordinary guy. When police contacted Forbes, he was cooperative. Too cooperative. Perhaps he readily admitted that he'd been with Kenya that night. His story was straightforward and seemed designed to portray him as a good Samaritan. He said he'd been downtown with a male friend when they encountered Kenya outside a nightclub around 3 a.m. She was clearly intoxicated and visibly upset, stumbling along the street. Concerned for her safety, Forbes said, he and his friend offered to help her find a cab or give her a ride home. According to Forbes, they couldn't find her car at a nearby club called Club Lavish, where Kenya thought she'd parked. So Forbes offered to drive her home in his white cargo van. They dropped off Forbes' friend first, and then, Forbes claimed, Kenya asked to stop at a Conoco gas station to get cigarettes. When they arrived, Forbes said the station was closed, but there was a man outside smoking. Kenya went to ask him for a cigarette, struck up a conversation with this mystery man, and then simply walked off with him. Forbes said the man looked clean-cut and trustworthy, so he didn't think twice about leaving Kenya with him. That, Forbes insisted, was the last time he saw her. Tony Lee met with Forbes in person during those early days of the investigation. Years later, he would recall shaking Forbes' hand and feeling it tremble in his grasp. "I knew then," Tony would say, "I was shaking the hand of the last person who saw Kenya alive. But knowing it and proving it were two different things. Police were deeply suspicious of Forbes' story. When they examined his white cargo van, they were hit by the overwhelming smell of bleach. The van had brand new carpeting. Both were significant red flags. Why would someone thoroughly bleach a vehicle and replace the carpet unless they were trying to hide evidence? Additionally, police discovered that Forbes was on probation for domestic violence. His criminal history was more extensive than it first appeared. He had a record for assault, trespassing, harassment, and theft stretching back to his teenage years. But suspicion wasn't evidence. Forbes stuck to his story, and without physical proof, police couldn't arrest him. They needed something more. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Kenya remained missing. Her family was trapped in an agonizing limbo, hoping she was alive but fearing the worst. Investigators continued building their case methodically. They obtained surveillance footage from the bakery where Forbes worked, hoping it might provide some answers. What they found was chilling. The footage showed Forbes entering the bakery owner's office the night after Kenya disappeared and unplugging the surveillance system. But he'd been picked up on another camera that he didn't know about. This camera captured Forbes wheeling in a large cooler and placing it inside a walk-in freezer. He was also seen carrying rags and bottles of bleach. The implications were horrifying, but still, without Kenya's body, police couldn't definitively prove what had happened. Forbes' girlfriend, Carrie Humphrey, became part of the investigation as well. When questioned, she told police that Forbes had called her during the early morning hours of April 1st, asking her to provide him with an alibi. Initially, she said he'd told her he'd slept in his van that night. Later, his story changed. He said he'd been on a marijuana run, which would have been a probation violation. Strangely, Humphrey never asked Forbes why he needed her to lie for him. She simply did it. Her compliance would later cost her dearly. She would eventually plead guilty to charges, including attempting to influence a public official, perjury, and making false reports to authorities. She was sentenced to 2,000 hours of community service and up to 2 years in Denver County Jail. While police were building their case against Forbes, summer arrived in Colorado. July 4th, 2011, brought warm weather and fireworks celebrations. In Fort Collins, about 65 miles north of Denver, a 30-year-old woman named Lydia Tillman went downtown to watch the Independence Day fireworks display. Lydia was an accomplished sommelier and world traveler, known for her warmth and adventurous spirit. After the fireworks, Lydia returned home to her apartment. Sometime in the early morning hours of July 5th, a stranger entered her apartment. What happened next was an act of such savage violence that it's difficult to comprehend. The intruder sexually assaulted Lydia. He beat her with such force that her jaw was shattered. He stomped on her body. He strangled her until she lost consciousness. And then, believing she was dead or would soon die, he attempted to destroy all evidence. He poured bleach over her body and throughout her apartment, and then he set the apartment on fire. But Lydia Tillman was not dead. Against all odds, she regained consciousness as flames began spreading through her apartment. In an act of extraordinary courage and survival instinct, she dragged herself to a window and jumped from the second story of the building. By what can only be described as a miracle, an ambulance happened to be arriving at the scene just as she jumped. Paramedics immediately began treating her. When they asked if she knew who had attacked her, Lydia managed to say, no, before suffering a massive stroke. She fell into a coma that would last for more than 5 weeks. When her father, Willie Tillman, arrived at the hospital, he couldn't even recognize his own daughter. Her face was so swollen and discolored from the beating that she was unidentifiable. Only a ring she wore and a tattoo on her leg confirmed her identity. Despite the bleach, despite the fire, Lydia had managed to preserve evidence. During the assault, she had fought back, and beneath her fingernails, crime scene technicians found DNA. When that DNA was analyzed, it came back with a match: Travis Forbes. On July 10th, 2011, Fort Collins police arrested Travis Forbes. Officers found him walking near the Colorado State University campus with another woman. When initially stopped, Forbes gave a false name, claiming to be Travis Kennedy. The pattern was unmistakable. He was hunting again, with DNA evidence tying him to Lydia Tillman's brutal assault and strong circumstantial evidence connecting him to Kenya Monge's disappearance. Forbes knew his time was up, but he was still calculating, still trying to control the narrative. He told police he would confess to everything, but he had conditions. He wanted assurance that prosecutors would not seek the death penalty, and he wanted to ensure he wouldn't be labeled as a sex offender in prison. The first condition was negotiable. The second was not, but the deal was struck nonetheless. Forbes agreed to tell police everything if they would spare his life. On August 23, 2011, a Denver detective visited Forbes in the Larimer County Jail. In a recorded interview, Forbes finally confessed to the murder of Kenny Amanje. His confession was matter-of-fact, almost clinical, though he still tried to minimize his culpability and portray events as somehow accidental or unplanned. Forbes admitted that he and his friend had spotted Kenny outside the 24K lounge that night. She was clearly intoxicated and vulnerable. They initially tried to help her find a cab, Forbes claimed, but when that didn't work out, he offered her a ride in his van. His friend came along at first, but after Forbes dropped him off, it was just Forbes and Kenya alone in the van. And that's when Forbes said Kenya passed out. "I definitely took advantage of her being drunk," Forbes told investigators. He admitted that he raped Kenya while she was unconscious in the back of his van. "She kinda came to and she realized that we had had sex," Forbes said, using language that minimized the horror of what he'd done. Kenya wasn't confused about what had happened. She knew she'd been violated. And she started hitting me and I started hitting her back. And then she started to scream. It was the screaming that Forbes couldn't tolerate. On a city street in the early morning hours, a screaming woman would attract attention, so Forbes made a choice. "And I strangled her. I strangled her. I strangled her," he repeated to investigators. "I killed her." Forbes drove around Denver with Kenya's body in the back of his van for an entire day, trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, he put her remains inside a large cooler, wheeled it into the bakery where he worked, and placed it in the walk-in freezer. He cut off her clothes and burned them. He thoroughly cleaned his van with bleach and replaced the carpeting. Then, when he felt ready, he drove to a field near Keensburg, about 40 miles northeast of Denver, and buried Kenya in a shallow grave under a small grove of trees. Forbes led police to the location. On September 7, 2011, 5 months and 7 days after Kenya disappeared, her remains were recovered. The Denver Medical Examiner's Office couldn't definitively determine the cause of death due to the condition of the remains, but asphyxia, strangulation, and suffocation were listed as likely causes. On September 26, 2011, Travis Forbes stood in Denver District Court and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in the death of Kenny Amanje. He was immediately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In court, Forbes wept and apologized, saying, "What I did was horrible and cowardly. It was a mistake. For the people that knew me, I have to say, remember me, please. Remember me as I was, not the monster I became. I'm sorry." But his words rang hollow. The remorse he claimed was contradicted by his actions, because after Forbes raped and murdered Kenya Amanje, after he buried her body and scrubbed away the evidence, he'd gone out and tried to do the exact same thing to Lydia Tillman. There was no mistake. There was no accident. Travis Forbes was a predator who attacked vulnerable women, and he would have continued doing so if Lydia hadn't survived. The following day, September 27, 2011, Forbes appeared in Larimer County Court and pleaded guilty to attempted first-degree murder and sexual assault in the attack on Lydia Tillman. He was sentenced to an additional 48 years in prison, to be served consecutively with his life sentence. During that hearing, Forbes spoke directly to Lydia, saying, "I committed a very horrible crime. It was an extreme, violent, and angry act. In searching my soul as to why I committed such a horrible crime, it was completely random. It had nothing to do with Lydia. It is a godsend that she survived." Lydia Tillman, who had relearned how to speak after her stroke, submitted a written statement that was read in court. Her words were powerful. "Travis Forbes, you caused me no harm." She was reclaiming her narrative, refusing to let him define her story. Though her physical recovery would take years, her spirit remained unbroken. Kenya's funeral was held on September 16, 2011, at Glory to Glory Christian Center in Aurora. Several hundred people attended the service, which was conducted in both English and Spanish to honor Kenya's heritage. Attendees wore pink and black, Kenya's favorite colors. Some wore Hello Kitty items in her memory. Maria Lee prepared a pink room in their home for Kenya. decorated with Disney princess posters and stuffed animals, perhaps trying to preserve the innocence of the little girl she'd once left behind in Honduras. The daughter she'd worked so hard to bring to America, the young woman whose life had been stolen just as she was beginning to bloom. Kenya was laid to rest at Hampton Memorial Estates in Denver. The family established the Kenya Manji Foundation to help other families dealing with missing persons cases, and to educate young women about safety and awareness. After Forbes's arrest, a fuller picture of his criminal history emerged, and it was deeply disturbing. At 17, Forbes had broken into 16 Fort Collins homes and businesses, stealing more than $15,000 worth of money and merchandise. When police searched his room, they found pairs of women's underwear that he had stolen and vandalized. Even while on probation for those crimes, Forbes was arrested for criminal harassment, caught carrying a knife, and violated curfew 43 times. In 2004, 2 female joggers in Highlands Ranch were hit by rocks thrown by Forbes. He was arrested and charged with assault. The pattern was clear. Travis Forbes had a specific hatred and aggression toward women that manifested in progressively more violent acts. The justice system had multiple opportunities to recognize the danger he posed, but he kept slipping through the cracks. His sentences too light, his probations too lenient, until finally his violence escalated to rape and murder. On July 13, 2017, Travis Forbes was found dead in his cell at the Limon Correctional Facility in Colorado. He had taken his own life. He was 37 years old and had been serving his sentence for 6 years. Reports indicated he had been on suicide watch and was being monitored closely by prison staff. Some speculated that guilt and shame had finally overwhelmed him. Others suggested it was a final act of control from a man who had always sought to control and dominate others. His death brought no closure to Kenya's family. Their daughter was still gone. Lydia Tillman was still recovering from physical and emotional trauma. Forbes's suicide was simply the end of a story that should never have been written in the first place. Kenya Manji was 19 years old when she died. She stood 4 feet 11 inches tall and weighed 115 pounds. She loved pink and Hello Kitty. She dreamed of working in broadcasting. She spoke both English and Spanish. She had lived in the United States for only 7 years, but she had embraced her new home with enthusiasm and hope. She was her mother's greatest achievement and her stepfather's beloved daughter. She was a sister, a girlfriend, a friend. She was a young woman with dreams and potential and a future that was stolen from her by a man who saw her only as prey. Her story is a reminder of how vulnerable we all are, how quickly a night out can turn into tragedy, how predators hide in plain sight, and how the justice system sometimes fails to protect us from those who mean us harm. But it's also a story about a family's love, about a mother who sacrificed everything to give her daughter opportunities, about a stepfather who searched tirelessly for answers, about a community that rallied together, and about a survivor named Lydia Tillman who refused to let evil win. When we remember Kenya Manji, we should remember her not as a victim, but as a person, a daughter who crossed borders and oceans to be with her mother, a young woman with dreams and ambitions, a soul who brought joy to those who knew her. Her life mattered, her story mattered, and by telling it, we honor her memory and remind ourselves to look out for one another, to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, and to never stop fighting for justice. Rest in peace, Kenya Manji. You deserved so much more than the world gave you. So if you're still awake, I'd like to know which of tonight's stories gave you chills the most. Was it the first story, the second, or the third? Meanwhile, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Sometimes a single decision can change the course of a life forever. For 17-year-old Brittany Drexel, that decision was made in the spring of 2009, when she chose to defy her mother's wishes and embark on a spring break trip that would end in unimaginable tragedy. This is the story of a teenage girl who vanished into the night, and the 13-year search that finally brought answers to a grieving family. Brittany Marie Drexel entered the world on October 7, 1991. In Rochester, New York, born to teenage parents John Kayalglu and Dawn. Brittany's early life was marked by change when her mother married Chad Drexel, who lovingly adopted the infant girl and gave her his name. The family eventually settled in Chile, a quiet suburb of Rochester, where Brittany would spend her formative years. From birth, Brittany faced a medical challenge that would become part of her distinctive appearance. She was born with persistent hyperplastic primary vitreous in her right eye, a condition that required multiple surgeries throughout her childhood. Despite the best efforts of doctors, the eye remained blind and had a tendency to wander. To address this, Brittany wore specially tinted contact lenses that gave her eyes an unusual but striking look. Friends and family would later note that this distinctive feature made her easily recognizable. By the time she reached her junior year at Gates Chili High School in 2009, Brittany had blossomed into a popular, vivacious teenager with big dreams. She was known for her warm personality and infectious energy. Those who knew her described her as a doting big sister to her younger brother Camden, and she harbored aspirations of one day leaving her small town to pursue a career in fashion design. She had a particular interest in modeling, often talking about her dreams of working in the fashion industry. Brittany was in a relationship with a classmate named John Greco. Their relationship was the kind of first love that teenagers experience intensely and completely. John worked after school and on weekends, which would prove significant as spring break approached. The two were inseparable when together, constantly texting and calling when apart. But beneath the surface of this seemingly typical teenage life, there were tensions brewing at home. Brittany's mother, Dawn, was going through a difficult period. She and Chad were in the process of divorcing, and financial pressures were mounting. Dawn was struggling to keep the family home, and the stress permeated the household. For Brittany, who craved stability during this turbulent time, the situation at home made the prospect of escape all the more appealing. In April 2009, as spring break approached, Brittany came to her mother with a request. She wanted to go to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, with some friends for the week. It was a common spring break destination, known for its miles of sandy beaches, warm weather, and the thousands of teenagers who descended upon it each year. Dawn's answer was immediate and firm. No. Her reasons were practical and rooted in parental concern. She didn't know these particular friends well. There would be no adult supervision on the trip, and beyond these logical concerns, Dawn experienced something that many mothers might understand but struggle to articulate: a deep, unsettling premonition that something terrible would happen if Brittany made that trip. I said, "There's no parental supervision," Dawn would later recall, and I said, "Something is going to happen to you." The refusals sparked arguments between mother and daughter. For several days, the tension in the household grew. Brittany pushed back against her mother's decision, as teenagers often do when they feel their independence is being curtailed. Dawn held firm, but the conflict took its toll on both of them. Then, on April 22, 2009, Brittany made a request that seemed like a reasonable compromise. Could she spend a day or two at a friend's house, just to calm down and get some space from the tension at home? Dawn, hoping that a brief separation might help diffuse the situation, agreed. It seemed harmless enough. Brittany had never given her mother reason to doubt her before. What Dawn didn't know was that her daughter was about to make a decision that would seal her fate. Brittany had no intention of staying at a friend's house in Rochester. Instead, she and three companions, Jennifer Oberer, Philip Oberer, and Alana Lipa, had already made plans for an entirely different kind of trip. On that same day, April 22nd, Brittany and her friends began the long drive south. The distance from Rochester, New York to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, stretches approximately 800 miles. It's the kind of journey that takes 13 hours or more, depending on traffic and stops. For four teenagers in a car, it would have been an adventure unto itself. The anticipation building with each passing mile. Throughout the journey, Brittany maintained the deception. She checked in with her mother, her voice casual and unremarkable, giving no indication that she was hundreds of miles from where she was supposed to be. Dawn had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. The weather in Rochester had reached an unseasonable high of 83 degrees that week. When Brittany mentioned she was at the beach, Dawn naturally assumed she meant one of the swimming spots along Lake Ontario's shoreline. The group arrived in Myrtle Beach on the morning of April 23rd, checking into the Bar Harbor Hotel on North Ocean Boulevard. Brittany's sister Marissa later reflected on this period. "Me and my mom thought she was here in Rochester, but in reality she wasn't. Myrtle Beach in April is transformed during spring break. The permanent population of the city swells dramatically as thousands of college students and teenagers flood in, seeking sun, freedom, and the kind of memories that define youth. The main strip, Ocean Boulevard, becomes a river of humanity. Young people walking between hotels, restaurants, and clubs, the air thick with music and the salt spray from the Atlantic. For Brittany, those first days must have felt like freedom. She was away from the tensions at home, surrounded by friends, with the beach stretching endlessly before her. John Greco, who had stayed behind in Rochester because of work commitments, kept in constant contact with her. The two exchanged text messages throughout the day and evening, maintaining their connection across the distance. But something wasn't quite right about this trip. Looking back, Dawn Drexel would come to believe that Brittany had been specifically encouraged to come to Myrtle Beach. That perhaps she had been promised something. Dawn theorized that her daughter might have been lured with the prospect of something that appealed to her dreams. Perhaps a modeling opportunity, or some other enticement that would have been irresistible to a 17-year-old with aspirations of a bigger life. Whether this was true or simply a mother's attempt to make sense of an incomprehensible situation, we may never fully know. What is certain is that by April 25, 2009, just 3 days after arriving in Myrtle Beach, Brittany's spring break trip was not going as she had hoped. Saturday, April 25, 2011, began like any other day of spring break. The weather was pleasant, the beach was crowded, and Brittany was still in regular contact with John back in Rochester. But in their text exchanges that day, John noticed something concerning. Brittany mentioned that things weren't going well, that the trip wasn't living up to her expectations. That evening around 8 o'clock, Brittany made a decision that would place her directly in the path of evil. She left her friends at the Bar Harbor Hotel to walk south along Ocean Boulevard. Her destination was the Blue Water Resort, about 1.5 miles away, where another friend from Rochester was staying. Peter Borozowitz was 20 years old, a nightclub promoter who knew Brittany from back home. He was staying at the Blue Water with several other young men: Anthony Schmitzy, Philip Watson, Keith Cummings, and Matthew Abrams. They had briefly met Brittany at Club Kryptonite the previous night, though most of them didn't really know her well. Security cameras at the Blue Water Resort captured Brittany's arrival. The footage shows a slender teenage girl with long blonde hair, wearing a black and white tank top, shorts, and flip-flops. She carried a beige purse, the kind of casual outfit that thousands of other teenagers wore. That night along the same stretch of beach, nothing about her appearance suggested what was about to happen. She looked like what she was, a 17-year-old girl on spring break. Brittany visited with Borozowitz and his friends for a while, though the exact nature of their interaction remains unclear. What we do know is that around 8:45 p.m., she left the Blue Water Resort. The security cameras captured this moment too. Brittany walking out of the lobby, heading back into the night. She began the walk back to her own hotel, texting with John as she went. Around 9 p.m., she sent him a message saying she was heading back to the Bar Harbor. It was a typical text from a girlfriend to her boyfriend, the kind of mundane communication that marks a relationship. Neither of them could have known it would be her last. Then suddenly the text messages stopped. John waited for her response, but none came. He sent another message, then another. His text went unanswered. Concerned, he called her phone. It rang, but Brittany didn't answer. Growing increasingly worried, John began calling Brittany's friends in Myrtle Beach. Had anyone seen her? Did anyone know where she was? The answers were troubling. No one had seen her. No one knew where she was. She had simply vanished during that walk back to her hotel. A walk that should have taken no more than 30 minutes along a well-lit, heavily populated stretch of road. Finally, desperate and frightened, John made the call he knew he had to make. He contacted Dawn Drexel. It was only then that Brittany's mother learned the truth. Her daughter had never been at a friend's house in Rochester. She had been in Myrtle Beach all along, and now she was missing. Dawn's world shattered in that moment. The premonition she had tried to prevent had come to pass anyway. Without hesitation, she called Chet and then the Rochester police, hoping they could quickly establish communication with authorities in South Carolina. Every minute felt crucial. Every passing hour increased the possibilities of what might have happened to Brittany. The police made repeated calls to Brittany's phone throughout the night. Every call went unanswered. Dawn and Chad sent text messages, pleading with their daughter to respond, to let them know she was safe. The silence was deafening. The Myrtle Beach Police Department began their investigation the following morning, April 26th. They quickly located the security footage from the Blue Water Resort and began interviewing the friends Brittany had visited. Peter Bruzewitz was identified as the last person known to have seen her before she left the hotel. He told police that after Brittany left, he and his friends had continued hanging out at the Blue Water. His alibi would eventually check out, though the intensive questioning led him to retain an attorney due to what his lawyer called repetitive questioning. For years, Bruzewitz would carry the weight of being the last known person to see Brittany Drexel alive. Investigators made a crucial discovery early in their investigation. Brittany's cell phone had continued transmitting signals after she stopped texting with John. The phone's location data painted a disturbing picture. The signals showed movement from Myrtle Beach heading south along Highway 17. The phone traveled approximately 60 miles south, moving through the South Carolina Low Country, a region of swamps, marshes, and sparsely populated areas, before the signal stopped completely near Georgetown, a small coastal town. This was not the pattern of a teenage runaway who had simply decided to disappear for a while. This was the pattern of an abduction. Within days, the case began to attract significant media attention. Dawn Drexel made the 13-hour drive south, arriving in Myrtle Beach determined to find her daughter. Initially, local law enforcement had been inclined to treat the case as a possible runaway situation. A teenager who had fought with her parents and might have taken off on her own. But Dawn's arrival, her insistence that something terrible had happened, and her appeals to the media helped shift the investigation into higher gear. On April 29th, multiple people reported seeing someone matching Brittany's description on a bus in Myrtle Beach, getting off on Ocean Boulevard. Police investigated these claims, but they led nowhere. Meanwhile, Brittany's family took the desperate step of depositing money into her ATM account, hoping that if she tried to access it, the transaction would provide a clue to her location. The account showed no activity. In the following weeks, police released the hotel's surveillance footage to the public, along with traffic camera footage from Ocean Boulevard. The Drexel family appeared on national television shows, including an appearance on Dr. Phil. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted. An age-progressed artist sketch was eventually created, showing what Brittany might look like as she got older. Her classmates held a graduation ceremony, where Gates Chili High School awarded her an honorary diploma, the first in the school's history. But despite the publicity, despite the searches, despite the thousands of tips that poured in, there were no solid leads. Brittany Drexel had seemingly vanished into thin air. As investigators dug deeper into the case, one name kept surfacing: Raymond Douglas Moody. A family member of Brittany's contacted law enforcement in 2011, suggesting they might want to investigate Moody, who was living in Georgetown, South Carolina, precisely the area where Brittany's phone signals had ended. Moody's background was deeply troubling. In 1983, while living in California, he had committed a series of horrific crimes against children. On a winter day in Vallejo, California, 8-year-old Carrie Harding was walking to meet a friend at a playground when Moody abducted her. He forced the child into his car and drove her to a construction site, where he subjected her to hours of sexual assault. Carrie would later describe how quickly it happened. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. He had me in his car and had driven away within seconds. But Carrie was one of 7 victims. Moody had systematically targeted young girls throughout Northern California. His youngest victim just 5 years old, his oldest 17. The crimes included rape, kidnapping, sodomy of children, while inflicting great bodily injury and assault with intent to commit mayhem. His violence was calculated and cruel. During one assault, a victim managed to notice a green military sticker on his car, a detail that would eventually lead to his arrest. In December 1983, Moody was convicted and sentenced to 40 years and 4 months in the California Department of Corrections. He should have remained behind bars until well into the 2020s. But California's prison system operates under different parole guidelines than many states. In 2004, after serving only 21 years, barely half his sentence, Raymond Moody was released on parole. A psychiatrist had determined he was no longer a threat to society. Carrie Harding, now an adult, watched in horror as her attacker walked free. He should have never been released, she told reporters. Why would the courts even take a chance with our children? Moody returned to his hometown of Georgetown, South Carolina, moving in with his elderly parents. His return caused alarm among neighbors, who suddenly found themselves living near a registered sex offender less than 3 blocks from a school. In 2008, he was arrested for indecent exposure in Georgetown. In 2009, he failed to register as a sex offender as required by law. a violation for which he was eventually convicted in 2010. When investigators began looking at Moody in connection with Brittany's disappearance, they discovered an unsettling coincidence. The day after Brittany vanished, Moody had been pulled over for a traffic violation in Surfside Beach, an area close to Myrtle Beach. The traffic stop report noted something unusual. Moody had visible scratches on his face. Authorities obtained a warrant to search the Sunset Lodge in Pawleys Island, a motel where Moody and his girlfriend Angel Cooper Voss had rented an apartment in late April 2009. They also visited Moody at his cabinet shop to question him. When an investigator told Moody they were searching for Brittany Drexel, he responded cryptically, "You're smart, you'll figure it out." But the search produced no physical evidence linking him to the disappearance. And without more concrete proof, the investigation stalled. Moody's former partner, Ernest Merchant, later came forward with a disturbing recollection. A couple of days after Brittany had gone missing, Moody showed up unexpectedly at Merchant's home. "I saw that his face had claw marks all over it," Merchant recalled. But this observation, too, was not enough for an arrest without additional evidence. In 2016, 7 years after Brittany's disappearance, the FBI held a press conference that would send the investigation in an entirely different direction. They announced that they believed Brittany had been murdered shortly after her disappearance, and they revealed information from a prison informant that pointed to a different suspect. Taquan Brown, an inmate serving a 25-year sentence for manslaughter, came forward with the story. He claimed that shortly after Brittany disappeared, he had visited a stash house in McClellanville to give money to a man he knew. While there, Brown claimed to have seen a white teenage girl matching Brittany's description. According to his account, he witnessed violent activity in the house and saw what he believed to be Brittany's body being carried out, wrapped in a rug. Brown implicated Timothy Deshawn Taylor and Taylor's father in Brittany's murder. He claimed he had witnessed Timothy Taylor, a man known only to him as Nate, shoot Brittany twice with a double-barreled shotgun in a wooded area. The FBI took this information seriously enough to publicly name Taylor as a suspect. Timothy Taylor vehemently denied the allegations. His attorneys argued that he had been immediately interrogated about the Drexel case, following his arrest on an unrelated robbery charge. Even though he was never charged with anything related to Brittany, Taylor released a statement maintaining his innocence, claiming that the FBI had been given false information by an inmate desperate to cut a deal for his own case. For years, this lead dominated the investigation. Searches were conducted in Charleston County near McClellanville. The media reported extensively on the Taylor connection. Brittany's father, Chad Drexel, even created a petition asking a grand jury to weigh in on the eyewitness claims and potentially indict Taylor if they found the claims credible. But it was all a dead end. The informant's story, which had seemed so detailed and credible, could not be corroborated. No physical evidence linked Taylor to the crime. Years would pass with no progress, no answers, no justice. The case grew cold once again. By 2019, more than 10 years after Brittany's disappearance, a new team of FBI investigators took over the case. Rather than rely on informants or chase new theories, they decided to go back to the basics, the hard evidence that had been there from the beginning. FBI intelligence analyst Caleb Messer and Special Agent James Kavanaugh began a painstaking process of re-examining the cell phone data and surveillance footage. The technology for analyzing cell phone location data had advanced significantly since Using sophisticated new techniques, they were able to determine not just where Brittany's phone had traveled, but the speed at which it was moving. The analysis revealed something crucial. At approximately 9:15 p.m. on April 25th, 2009, Brittany's phone went from moving at walking speed about 3 to 4 miles per hour to suddenly moving at 55 miles per hour. This could only mean one thing. She had gotten into or been forced into a vehicle. The investigators then turned their attention back to the surveillance footage from Ocean Boulevard, specifically focusing on the time period when Brittany would have been making her walk from the Blue Water Resort back to the Bar Harbor Hotel. They were looking for a vehicle that appeared in the footage during that specific time frame, and that could have been heading south toward Georgetown. Eventually, one vehicle stood out, a 1998 Ford Explorer. The investigators worked to identify who had access to that vehicle in April 2009. The trail led them to a woman named Angel Cooper Voss, Raymond Moody's longtime girlfriend. Then investigators caught a break they hadn't expected. They obtained a police recording from a separate matter, in which Voss had been captured on tape talking with a friend. On that recording, Voss had said something shocking. She claimed to be responsible for Brittany Drexel's death. When authorities interviewed Voss about this statement, she attempted to walk it back. She claimed she had been drinking when the recording was made, and that her friend kept asking about Moody's involvement in the case. According to Voss, she had falsely claimed responsibility just to take attention away from Moody, to make people leave him alone. She insisted she had just wanted to protect him. During this interview, Voss told investigators that she still had the cell phone she had been using in April 2009 and offered to locate it for them. But after leaving the interview, she never followed through on this promise. The phone was never produced. The pieces were coming together, but investigators needed more. They needed Moody himself. On May 4, 2022, more than 13 years after Brittany vanished, FBI agents and local law enforcement approached Raymond Moody. They informed him that both he and Voss were the subjects of the investigation into Brittany Drexel's disappearance and murder. They asked if he would be willing to sit down for an interview. Moody agreed. Perhaps he sensed that the walls were finally closing in. Perhaps he was tired of carrying the secret for 13 years. Perhaps he felt genuine remorse. Whatever his motivation, on May 5, 2022, Raymond Douglas Moody confessed to murdering Brittany Drexel. In his confession, recorded on video with his lawyer present, Moody's demeanor was disturbingly nonchalant. He even cracked a few jokes during the interview, a stark contrast to the gravity of what he was admitting. He detailed the events of that night in April 2000. According to Moody's account, he and Angel Voss had gone hunting for a victim that night. They were driving along Ocean Boulevard in their Ford Explorer when they spotted Brittany walking alone. This was the critical 15 to 20 minute window when she would have been making her way back to the Bar Harbor Hotel. Voss, according to Moody, was the one who called out to Brittany. She offered the teenage girl a ride, promising to take her back to her hotel. Brittany, perhaps feeling the ache in her feet from walking in flip-flops, perhaps simply trusting in the apparent kindness of a female stranger, got into the vehicle. But instead of heading north back toward her hotel, Moody drove south. As they drove past the Bar Harbor, Brittany would have realized something was terribly wrong. Dawn Drexel would later reflect on this moment. When they drove past the hotel, she was probably like, "I'm in trouble." I couldn't imagine how scared she was. Moody drove approximately 40 miles south to a remote location near Georgetown, the Pole Yard boat landing on the Santee River. Voss took Brittany's cell phone and left, leaving the teenager alone with Moody at the isolated campsite. What followed was unspeakable. Moody raped Brittany, then strangled her to death. Throughout the attack, Brittany fought desperately for her life, scratching at her attacker's face and leaving the marks that would be visible the next day during his traffic stop. After murdering Brittany, Moody disposed of her cell phone in the North Santee River. Then he returned to meet Voss, telling her that Brittany had left with friends. In the middle of the night, Moody returned alone to move Brittany's body. He buried her in a shallow grave, just 4 feet deep, in a wooded area, about 10 miles north of the boat landing, approximately 2.5 miles from where he had been living. And there she remained, alone in the darkness, while her family searched desperately for 13 years. On May 11, 2022, following Moody's confession and with his cooperation in identifying the location, law enforcement officers made their way to that wooded area near Georgetown. They found what remained of Brittany Drexel. Her identity was confirmed through dental records and DNA analysis. On May 16, 2022, Georgetown County Sheriff Carter Weaver held a press conference to announce the devastating news. Raymond Moody had been arrested and charged with murder, kidnapping, and first-degree criminal sexual conduct. The charges alleged that the crimes had occurred on April 25, 2009, and that Brittany had been buried by the morning of April 26th. The day of the press conference, Brittany's family was taken to the site where her remains had been found. Dawn Drexel later described the moment. "I think I went numb again and I was just so angry." For Dawn, the discovery brought both relief and fresh anguish. After 13 years of not knowing, of hoping against hope that perhaps Brittany was still alive somewhere, of imagining every possible scenario, she finally had answers. But those answers confirmed her worst fears. Her daughter had been murdered within hours of her disappearance, had died terrified and alone, had spent 13 years in a shallow grave while her killer walked free. On October 19, 2022, Raymond Moody stood before a judge in Georgetown County. He pleaded guilty to all charges: murder, kidnapping, and first-degree criminal sexual conduct. The state dropped an obstruction of justice charge as part of the plea agreement. During the hearing, Brittany's family members spoke directly to Moody, finally given the chance to address the man who had destroyed their lives. Chad Drexel, Brittany's adoptive father, his voice thick with emotion, spoke of the 13 years of agony. 13 years later, I found out the horrible, disgusting, senseless way she was murdered. Every part of my being wants to say and do something about that. Dawn Drexel spoke with remarkable composure, but her words carried the weight of a mother's grief and a mother's pride in her daughter's final fight. I am so glad my daughter was feisty. She fought back. She fought for her life. We know now she scratched the hell out of your head, face and neck. You will forever carry the scars of what my daughter did to you, and I hope you are haunted by what you did to her. Camden Drexel, Brittany's younger brother, who was just a child when his sister disappeared, and was now a young man, spoke of his plans to honor her memory. I want to live for her, he said, explaining his decision to attend film school. Then Moody spoke. Standing with the aid of a crutch, he addressed the court and the family. I was a monster. I was a monster then, and I was a monster when I took Brittany Drexel's life. I don't have the words to express how horrible I feel, and I've felt ever since that day. I'm very, very sorry. His apology also included reference to his previous crimes in California decades earlier. Whether his remorse was genuine or simply a performance is something only Moody truly knows. The prosecuting attorney later commented that while he believed Moody felt remorse, I believe he is remorseful because he was caught. Judge R. Farrell Cothran, Jr. sentenced Moody to life in prison without the possibility of parole for murder, plus 2 consecutive 30-year sentences for kidnapping and criminal sexual conduct. The judge's words were pointed. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people give up their long-term happiness for immediate pleasure. You gave up a lot of people's long-term happiness for your immediate pleasure. Raymond Douglas Moody, now in his 60s, will spend the rest of his life in the Kirkland Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. He will never again see the outside of a prison. The case was not yet fully closed. Angel Cooper Voss, who had been with Moody that night and had helped lure Brittany into their vehicle, initially avoided charges. But in March 2024, federal authorities arrested Voss on 3 counts of lying to the FBI about her involvement in Brittany's murder. The government's case against Voss was strong. She had lied about multiple key facts. She claimed Brittany had voluntarily joined her and Moody, when in reality she had lured the teenager under false pretenses. She claimed she had left Moody and Brittany at the boat landing without taking Brittany's phone, when in fact she had deliberately taken the girl's only means of calling for help. She claimed not to know what had happened to Brittany, when she knew full well that Moody had murdered her. In September 2024, Voss pleaded guilty to all counts. The defense attempted to portray her as another victim of Moody's manipulation, claiming that even from a prison cell, Ray still held sway over Angel. They argued that Moody had manipulated her into backing out of an initial plea agreement and was now conducting a personal vendetta against her from prison, making allegations to worsen her sentence. But prosecutors painted a different picture. They argued that Voss had been a willing participant in luring Brittany to her death, that she had deliberately taken the teenager's cell phone, her only chance of survival, and that she had concealed the truth for more than 13 years. Allowing Moody to remain free and potentially harm others. On February 13th, 2025, U.S. District Judge Richard Gergel sentenced 57-year-old Angel Voss to 18 years in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. Assistant U.S. Attorney Winston Holliday spoke to reporters after the sentencing. One would be, obviously, the family. As you could probably tell, a lot of pain, a lot of emotion with the family, but that has motivated them to stay with the case from 2009. And then also the persistence and perseverance of the FBI. This is one of the most extraordinary efforts I've ever seen from the FBI. Ray Moody would not be in prison if not for the FBI. He noted with satisfaction that Voss, who was 57 at sentencing, would be 75 by the time she completed her sentence. You know, she's a 57-year-old woman. 18 plus 57 is 75, he said, letting the mathematics speak for themselves. Even with both Moody and Voss behind bars, questions linger. In 2023, Dawn Plecken filed a civil lawsuit against Moody, Angel Voss, and the Bar Harbor Hotel. The lawsuit alleged that the hotel had failed to prevent an unaccompanied minor from checking in, and that they had no policies in place to detect and alert law enforcement to the presence of underage guests without parental supervision. The hotel denied these allegations, arguing that Brittany had never been a registered guest at the Bar Harbor Hotel. They claimed she may have been friends with Jennifer Ober, who was a registered guest. The legal battle over who bore responsibility for allowing a 17-year-old to stay at the hotel without adult supervision continued to wind through the courts. In February 2025, a Georgetown County jury found in favor of Brittany's family in the civil case against Moody. They awarded Dawn Plecken and her family $200 million in actual damages and $500 million in punitive damages, a total of $700 million. While Moody, imprisoned for life, has no means to pay such a judgment, the verdict served as a powerful symbolic statement about the magnitude of the harm he caused. The case has also led investigators to wonder about other possible victims. Moody was free in Georgetown from 2004 until his arrest in 2022. During that period, other young women went missing or were found dead in the region. In 2005, 28-year-old Crystal Souls disappeared. Authorities have looked into possible connections to Moody, though no charges have been filed in that case. The reality is sobering. Raymond Moody, a convicted child rapist who should have been in prison until well into the 2020s, was released early and given the opportunity to harm again, and he did. How many other shallow graves might exist? How many other families might be missing answers? These are questions that haunt investigators and victim advocates. Dawn Drexel has transformed her grief into action. She created Brittany's Law, advocating for stricter regulations on hotels that allow minors to check in without parental supervision. She has become a voice for other families of missing persons, using her painful experience to try to prevent similar tragedies. In interviews, Dawn has spoken about the guilt she carries, the weight of having said yes when Brittany asked to stay at a friend's house, the what-ifs that plague every parent who has lost a child. But she has also spoken about the strength she found in Brittany's memory, in knowing that her daughter fought back, that she didn't go quietly into the darkness. She was feisty, Dawn said, with a mother's pride mixed with sorrow. She fought for her life. Today, Brittany's grave is marked with a proper headstone in Rochester, New York, far from the shallow grave where she spent 13 years. Her family visits regularly, bringing flowers and memories. Her younger brother Camden has grown into adulthood, carrying his sister's memory with him as he pursues his dreams in film school. Dreams not unlike the fashion aspirations Brittany once held. The case serves as a stark reminder of how quickly life can change, how a single decision made by a teenager seeking independence can lead to irreversible consequences. It's a reminder of the predators who walk among us, sometimes freed by a system that fails to adequately protect the vulnerable. And it's a testament to the persistence of law enforcement who refuse to give up, even when the case seemed hopelessly cold. Brittany Drexel was 17 years old when her life was stolen from her on that April night in 2009. She never got to graduate from high school in person, never pursued her dreams of fashion design, never experienced the milestones of adulthood. She was buried in an unmarked grave for 13 years while her killer lived freely just miles away. But her story didn't end in that shallow grave. Through her family's determination, through the tireless work of investigators, through the power of advancing technology, and old-fashioned detective work, Brittany was finally brought home. Justice, though delayed, finally arrived. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Brittany Marie Drexel, not as a victim, but as a fighter. Remember her as a teenage girl with dreams, with a family who loved her, with a whole life ahead of her that should never have been taken. Remember that even in the darkest cases, even after 13 years, the truth can still emerge from the shadows. And remember that somewhere tonight, there are other families waiting for answers. Other cases that seem unsolvable. Other stories that haven't yet found their ending. The search for justice never truly ends. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the heart of northeastern Arkansas, where endless rice fields stretch toward distant horizons and the White River winds through ancient bottomlands, there exists a landscape that time seems to have forgotten. Jackson County is farming country, quiet, unassuming, where everyone knows everyone, and where family names carry the weight of generations. The towns here are small dots on the map. Newport, the county seat; Grubbs, a farming community of barely 400 souls. Tuckerman, where high school graduating classes rarely exceed 50 students. It's the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, where a wave from a passing truck is as natural as breathing, where the most exciting event might be Friday night football or the annual Depot Days festival celebrating the town's railroad heritage. The land is flat and fertile, cleared from forest and swamp by early settlers, transformed into some of the most productive agricultural acreage in the South. Rice and soybeans dominate the landscape now, their neat rows extending as far as the eye can see. In this close-knit world, Sydney Claire Sutherland had built a life full of promise and purpose. Born on September 18, 1995, in Jonesboro, Sydney, grew up on her family's farm in Grubbs, surrounded by love and the rhythms of rural life. Her parents, Diane and Maggie Sutherland, raised her alongside her two older brothers, Tyler and Sam, in a household where hard work and kindness were taught by example. The Sutherlands were the kind of family that formed the backbone of these small Arkansas communities. Decent, hard-working people whose roots ran deep in the red Delta soil. From an early age, Sydney possessed something that set her apart. Those who knew her always remarked on it. A genuine warmth, an authenticity that couldn't be manufactured. At Tuckerman High School, where she graduated in 2014, Sydney was more than just another student. She was active in the Spanish Club, Beta Club, and Key Club. She played softball for the Tuckerman Bulldogs, earning the title of Outstanding Senior, but what people remembered most wasn't the activities or the accolades. It was her outgoing, sweet personality, the way she made everyone feel seen and valued. Her senior yearbook quote captured the philosophy that would guide her short life. The meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away. And Sydney lived those words. After high school, she attended Arkansas State University at Newport, determined to build a career in healthcare. In July 2018, she earned her licensed practical nurse certificate. The work suited her, caring for others, offering comfort in moments of vulnerability. But Sydney wanted to do more. She continued her education at the University of Arkansas Community College at Batesville, and in December 2019, she became a registered nurse. By the summer of 2020, 24-year-old Sydney was working at Unity Health Harris Medical Center in Newport. Her colleagues described her as compassionate, dedicated, someone who truly cared about her patients. Outside of work, Sydney maintained close ties with her family. Her two nieces adored her, giving her the nickname Aunt Sassy. She attended the Grubbs Church of Christ. She lived with her boyfriend Alex Nicholson in a modest home. She loved to read, to shop, to exercise, and perhaps most importantly to this story, Sydney loved to run. Running was more than just exercise for Sydney. In the flat farmland of Jackson County, where the roads stretched straight and empty for miles, running offered solace, time to think, a way to decompress after long shifts at the hospital. She had irregular routes, loops that took her along county roads 41, 42, and 43, and Highway 18 between Newport and Grubbs. It was familiar territory, safe or so it seemed. Wednesday, August 19, 2020 began like countless other days in rural Arkansas. The summer heat bore down on the flat landscape, but for those who lived there, it was nothing unusual. Sydney finished up whatever tasks occupied her early afternoon. Around 1 p.m., she was photographed at a family member's home, smiling, vibrant, alive. Shortly after, she prepared for her run. She changed into her workout clothes, tied her running shoes, grabbed her phone and her sunglasses. The route she chose that day was one she'd traveled many times before, out along Highway 18, the two-lane road that connected Newport and Grubbs. It wasn't a busy highway by any stretch. Cars might pass every few minutes, maybe less. Mostly it was farmland, rice fields on either side, the occasional house or barn breaking the monotony of crops and sky. Sydney left her home sometime between 2 and 2:30 that afternoon. It was a normal run, a routine part of her life. A UPS driver, making his rounds in the area, spotted her near County Road 41 around that time. She was jogging westward. Alone, a small figure moving along the shoulder of the rural highway. The driver thought nothing of it. In communities like this, joggers and walkers were a common sight. But Sydney Sutherland never made it home that day. When Sydney didn't return by early evening, alarm bells began ringing immediately. This wasn't like her. She was responsible, reliable, always kept in touch with her family, her boyfriend, her parents. They all knew something was wrong. By 7 p.m., roughly 4 to 5 hours after she'd left for her run, Sydney's mother Maggie contacted the Jackson County Sheriff's Office to report her daughter missing. The response was swift. Sheriff David Lucas, who knew the Sutherland family personally, who had watched Sydney grow up in this tight-knit community, mobilized every available resource. By that evening, search teams were assembling. Family members, friends, neighbors. People dropped everything to help look for Sydney. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office coordinated with the Arkansas Department of Corrections, Arkansas State Police, U.S. Marshals, the FBI, and police departments from surrounding towns. By nightfall, more than 100 people were combing the area where Sydney had last been seen. They searched through the night using flashlights and headlamps, calling Sydney's name into the darkness. At 2 a.m., exhausted and with no leads, they paused to rest. But at 7:30 Thursday morning, the search resumed with renewed intensity. By then, word had spread throughout the region. People who didn't even know Sydney personally showed up to help. By some accounts, more than 170 volunteers joined the search on Thursday. They walked the roads, checked ditches, searched fields and barns. Helicopters from Arkansas State Police flew overhead, scanning the landscape for any sign of the missing woman. Search dogs from the Arkansas Department of Corrections tracked through the area, but hour after hour passed with no trace of Sydney. Then Thursday evening came the first break, though it offered no comfort. Searchers found Sydney's iPhone in a field approximately a quarter-mile from her home, just off Highway 67. The phone's location suggested she had made it a certain distance along her route before something happened. Nearby in a barn a few hundred yards from where the phone was discovered, investigators found a pair of broken sunglasses that belonged to Sydney. The discoveries were ominous. Why would Sydney's phone and glasses be separated from her like this? The implications sent chills through the search teams. And Sydney's family, this was no longer just a missing person case. Something terrible had happened. Throughout all of this, local residents were questioned. Investigators asked anyone who might have been in the area on Wednesday afternoon to come forward, to share whatever they might have seen. Among those interviewed was a local farmer named Quake Llewellyn. He told investigators that yes, he had been in the area. He'd been driving his truck, checking on rice fields and irrigation wells, routine work for a farmer. He said he'd seen Sydney jogging along the road, but hadn't thought anything of it. Just passed her by, he claimed. He couldn't offer any additional details. Llewellyn was no stranger in Jackson County. In fact, his family was well respected, even prominent. The Llewellyns operated a large farming operation, Favin Certain 800 acres across 4 counties: Jackson, Independence, Poinsett, and Craighead. In 2016, 3 generations of Llewellyn's grandfather Donald, father Michael, and son Quake had been named Jackson County's Farm Family of the Year. It was an honor that recognized not just their agricultural success, but their standing in the community. Quake Llewellyn was 28 years old in the summer of 2020. He'd grown up in Jackson County, raised by his mother and stepfather, who had adopted him during his high school years. The Llewellyns had provided a stable, supportive home. Quake attended Tuckerman High School, the same small school Sydney had graduated from, though they were in different classes, separated by a few years. In a school with graduating classes of fewer than 50 students, their paths had certainly crossed. At 23, Quake had moved into his first home. At 25, he married a local woman named Gracie, who brought 3 children from a previous relationship into the marriage. By 2020, hoping to save money to build their own house, Quake had moved his family back onto his parents' property. He worked a family farm, and he'd also rented 500 acres of his own, where he grew rice and beans. By all outward appearances, he was living the life expected of him, carrying on the family tradition, building a future respected in the community. But beneath that respectable exterior, something dark was lurking. Friday, August 21, 2020. Dawned with Sydney Sutherland still missing. 48 hours had passed since anyone had seen her alive. The search continued, but hope was fading. Sheriff David Lucas held press conferences, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. This was personal for him. He knew both the Sutherland and Llewellyn families. In a county of fewer than 17,000 people, especially in the rural townships, the degrees of separation between families were minimal. While search teams continued their work in the fields, investigators were following up on leads, re-interviewing witnesses, looking for anything they might have missed. They focused particularly on tracking cell phone data, trying to piece together Sydney's movements that Wednesday afternoon, and the movements of anyone who might have crossed her path. Advanced technology provided crucial information. Investigators discovered that Sydney's iPhone had been equipped with location tracking. They could see where it had been on the afternoon of August 19, up until the point when it was either turned off or the battery died. But more importantly, they began looking at the cell phones of people who had been in the area. Quake Llewellyn had voluntarily allowed investigators to search his phone. He seemed cooperative, even joining the search efforts on Thursday morning, standing alongside neighbors and volunteers as they looked for Sydney. But something had struck Maggie Sutherland as odd when she encountered Llewellyn during the search. She later told investigators that his behavior seemed off, though she couldn't quite articulate why. A mother's instinct, perhaps, sensing something wrong. When investigators examined Llewellyn's phone more closely, they made a startling discovery. He had a geolocation app called Life 360 installed, a family tracking app that many people use to keep tabs on their children's or spouse's whereabouts. The app kept detailed records of movement, and according to those records, on Wednesday afternoon, August 19, Quake Llewellyn's phone had been within 3 yards, just 9 feet of where Sydney Sutherland's phone had stopped transmitting. That wasn't all. The app showed Llewellyn's movements throughout that afternoon and evening. After the incident near where Sydney's phone went dead, his phone traveled approximately 2.36 miles away to a different location. A rice field. His phone had remained there for a period of time before returning to his home. The circumstantial evidence was mounting, but investigators needed more. They obtained search warrants for additional data from AT&T, Facebook, and Life 360. Meanwhile, they asked to search Llewellyn's 2019 GMC Sierra pickup truck. Both Quake and his father gave permission. Inside the truck, investigators found what appeared to be blood in the cracks of the tailgate and on the tailgate itself. It wasn't a large amount. Someone had made attempts to clean it, but blood is difficult to completely remove. Even small traces can be detected. Investigators also requested surveillance footage from Llewellyn's mother's home, where the family had been living. The family cooperated fully. In fact, it was Llewellyn's mother who voluntarily contacted detectives to provide the footage. When Llewellyn's wife Gracie reviewed the footage with investigators, she pointed out something significant. A dent on Quake's truck that appeared in footage from August 19. A dent that had not been there that morning. In the surveillance video, Quake could be seen wearing a particular style of shoes. Sanuk-style shoes. When investigators examined footprints found at the scene where Sydney's phone and sunglasses were discovered, those prints matched the tread pattern of the shoes Llewellyn was wearing in the video. During a search of his mother's home, investigators recovered those exact shoes. The evidence was overwhelming. On Friday evening, as searchers continued combing the fields for any sign of Sydney Sutherland, investigators brought Quake Llewellyn in for questioning. And there, in the interview room, the facade crumbled. Llewellyn confessed. The details of what happened on that Wednesday afternoon were almost incomprehensible in their brutality and senselessness. Quake Llewellyn told investigators that he'd been driving his truck, checking on rice fields and irrigation wells. Routine work. He saw Sydney jogging along County Road 40. He knew who she was. They'd gone to the same high school, lived in the same small community. They'd been friends on Facebook, though he'd recently unfriended her for reasons he never adequately explained. According to his confession, Llewellyn claimed the collision with Sydney was accidental. He told a court-appointed psychologist who later evaluated him that he'd been driving and a cloud of dust had obscured his vision. It was all just a blur, he said. Before he knew it, he'd hit her with his truck. But even if one accepted that the initial impact was accidental, though investigators had their doubts, what happened next was undeniably intentional and evil. Llewellyn said that when he got out of his truck, he believed Sydney was dead. He panicked, he claimed, afraid he'd be in trouble for running her over. So rather than call for help, rather than try to save her if she could be saved, he made a choice. He loaded Sydney's body, or what he believed was her body, onto the tailgate of his truck. He drove approximately 3 miles to a remote rice field. And there, in that isolated location, with Sydney either unconscious or severely injured, Quake Llewellyn raped her. Afterward, whether Sydney was alive or dead at that point remains unclear. He buried her body in a shallow grave in the rice field. Then, in an act of almost sociopathic compartmentalization, Llewellyn went about the rest of his day. He continued his farm work. Between 5 and 6 p.m., he went home. He had dinner with his wife and her 3 children. He went to bed. He told investigators he just tried to forget about it. The next morning, Thursday, August 20, Llewellyn woke up and, as he put it, pretended it was any other day. He went to work, and then, in an act that chilled investigators to their core, he joined the search party looking for Sydney Sutherland. He stood alongside her grieving family and friends, helping to search for a woman he knew was buried in a rice field 3 miles away. With Llewellyn's confession providing the location, investigators immediately traveled to the rice field he described. There on Friday evening, August 20, 48 hours after Sydney had vanished, they found her body buried in a makeshift grave. The Arkansas State Medical Examiner would later determine that Sydney Sutherland died from multiple blunt force injuries. Whether she died from the impact of the truck, from the assault that followed, or from being buried alive, the full truth may never be known. The arrest of Quake Lewin sent shockwaves through Jackson County. For Sydney's family, the confirmation that she was dead brought the grief they'd been trying to hold at bay crashing down in full force. But mixed with that grief was rage, confusion, a desperate need to understand why. Sheriff David Lucas, conducting press conferences, visibly struggled with the emotional toll. "It's taken a toll. It really has," he said. "Just because I know the people of this county. I know this family personally. I know this young lady personally. I've known her and watched her grow up." Prosecuting attorney Henry Boyce echoed that sentiment. "It's hard to live your life in a community of this size and not know just about everybody." On Monday, August 24, Quake Llewellyn appeared in Jackson County Court for a probable cause hearing. An Arkansas State Police agent testified about Llewellyn's confession, how he'd admitted to seeing Sydney walking on County Road 41, how he turned around, abducted her, taken her to farmland, sexually assaulted her, and buried her body. The judge found probable cause to charge Llewellyn with capital murder, kidnapping, rape, and abuse of a corpse. He was held without bond. As the case proceeded, more disturbing details emerged. Investigators obtained data from Llewellyn's Facebook account. They found messages, photos, videos, though the specific content of these was never made fully public. What was revealed was that despite Llewellyn's initial claims that he barely knew Sydney, the two had attended the same tiny high school and had been Facebook friends. Only recently had Llewellyn unfriended her. The question of why haunted everyone. Was it a crime of opportunity? Had he seen Sydney running alone on that empty road and something inside him snapped? Or had he deliberately sought her out? The fact that he'd recently unfriended her on Facebook suggested there may have been some prior interaction or dynamic between them that had gone sour, but no evidence of a previous relationship or conflict was ever established. In December 2020, Llewellyn's defense attorney requested a mental evaluation, stating it was in the best interest of Mr. Llewellyn. The implication was that Llewellyn might not be competent to stand trial or might not have been competent at the time of the crime due to mental illness. On January 7, 2021, forensic psychologist Dr. Lacey Willett conducted an in-person mental status examination of Llewellyn at the Arkansas State Hospital. During that evaluation, Llewellyn spoke about the day of the crime, maintaining his story that it had been an accident, that dust had obscured his vision, that he'd panicked. He claimed he had no history of mental illness or medical problems. He said he rarely drank and had no criminal history beyond a few speeding tickets. Dr. Willett's conclusion was unequivocal. "It is my opinion that at the time of the alleged conduct, Mr. Llewellyn did not manifest symptoms of a mental disease or mental defect. Mr. Llewellyn currently possesses an adequate factual and rational understanding of the proceedings against him, as well as the capacity to rationally assist in his own defense." In other words, Quake Llewellyn was mentally competent. He understood what he had done, he understood the charges against him, and he understood that he was facing the possibility of the death penalty. As the legal proceedings dragged on through 2020 and into 2021, two families in Jackson County tried to process the unimaginable. The Sutherland family laid Sydney to rest at Greenhouse Cemetery. Her funeral was held at the ASU Newport Center for the Arts, with visitation beforehand at Jackson's funeral home. Due to COVID-19 restrictions, attendance was limited, but the service was live-streamed so friends from across the country could participate. Her obituary spoke of her beautiful smile, sparkling eyes, kind heart, and loving spirit. Unity Health Harris Medical Center, where Sydney had worked, issued a statement. All of us at Unity Health are deeply saddened to hear of the loss of our precious co-worker, Sydney Sutherland. Our thoughts and prayers are with her family and friends. Arkansas State University at Newport created a scholarship in Sydney's honor, the Sydney Sutherland Memorial Scholarship for students pursuing careers in healthcare. The university's statement read, "Sydney Sutherland made an impact on everyone she met. She shined in the classroom, and ASU Newport is privileged to be a small part of her amazing life. Sydney devoted her life to helping others, and that legacy will continue with the Sydney Sutherland Memorial Scholarship." On August 22, 2020, just 3 days after Sydney vanished, the community held a candlelight vigil at Tuckerman City Park. Hundreds attended, holding candles in the gathering darkness, remembering a young woman whose life had been stolen far too soon. Friends spoke about how Sydney should be remembered, not for how she died, but for how she lived. She will be remembered forever, and not because of what happened, but because of who she was, said longtime friend Jordan Tyler Chapman. Another friend, Melanie Clark, added, "I don't want anyone to think Sydney's life was a tragedy, because Sydney's life was beautiful. Sydney was probably the best part of what every human wants to be." Meanwhile, the Llewellyn family was dealing with their own devastation. Just 5 days after Quake's arrest, his wife Gracie filed for divorce. Initially, the complaint cited abuse, contempt, and neglect, though her attorney later clarified that this was antiquated language, and there had been no physical abuse. An amended complaint filed on September 4, 2020, simply stated general indignities as grounds for divorce. The couple had been married for just 2 years. Gracie had 3 children from a previous relationship, but she and Quake had no biological children together. The divorce was granted, and Gracie's maiden name was restored. The psychological toll on Gracie and her children is difficult to imagine. The man they'd trusted, lived with, built a life with, the man who'd presented himself as a loving husband and stepfather, had committed an unspeakable act of violence. Reports later indicated that Gracie and her children were working through the trauma, trying to heal and move forward. Initially, prosecutors announced they would pursue the death penalty against Quake Llewellyn. Given the brutality of the crime and the evidence of premeditation, he'd confessed to turning his truck around to go back to where he'd seen Sydney. The death penalty seemed almost certain if a jury convicted him of capital murder. But securing a conviction at trial would mean putting the Sutherland family through a harrowing ordeal. They would have to sit through testimony detailing exactly what had happened to Sydney in her final moments. They would have to see autopsy photos, hear forensic evidence, relive the trauma over and over. And even if Llewellyn was convicted and sentenced to death, Arkansas death penalty cases typically dragged on for years, sometimes decades, through appeals. The family would never truly have closure. In August 2021, the case was moved from Jackson County to neighboring Lawrence County after the court ruled that extensive pretrial media coverage had made it impossible to seat an impartial jury in Jackson County. The case had drawn national attention, with coverage in major media outlets and true crime podcasts. In a county of fewer than 17,000 people, finding 12 people who hadn't followed the case or formed opinions about it would have been nearly impossible. Then on October 1, 2021, Quake Llewellyn appeared in court in Newport and did something unexpected. He pleaded guilty to capital murder and rape. In exchange for his guilty plea, prosecutors dropped the charges of kidnapping and abuse of a corpse. More significantly, by pleading guilty and waiving his right to a jury trial, Llewellyn avoided the possibility of the death penalty. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The plea deal had been approved by Sydney's family. This was crucial. Despite their rage, despite their grief, the Sutherlands understood that agreeing to the plea deal meant Quake Llewellyn would never breathe free air again, would never have a chance at parole, would die in prison, and perhaps most importantly, it meant they wouldn't have to endure a lengthy trial and years of appeals. Prosecuting attorney John D. Petty issued a statement. After a little more than 13 months, Quake Llewellyn has answered for his inexcusable and horrendous actions upon an innocent young lady. It is the hope of this office that the Sutherland family can now have some closure and sense of finality. No length of incarceration, no punishment available under the law will ever be sufficient to provide retribution for the deeds of the evil mind that perpetrated these heinous acts. This outcome ensures that Quake Llewellyn will never again breathe free air, and that the Sutherland family will not have to suffer the renewed trauma of appeal after appeal that accompanies death penalty cases. Llewellyn's defense attorney, Bill James, also spoke about the plea deal. My client and his family are glad this is over. It started out as an accident and just kind of went bad from there. He didn't want to put anyone through any more pain, so he felt like this was the best thing for everyone. James added, "We're certainly very happy and thankful to the family of the Sutherlands. They showed us mercy, because the truth is, it was very likely going to head towards the death penalty." The pre-trial publicity took over in a way I've never really been involved in before. At the sentencing hearing on October 1st, 2021, Sydney's family filled the Newport courtroom. They wanted to be there to see justice done, to look Quake Llewellyn in the eye, and tell him what he'd taken from them. Sydney's mother, Maggie Sutherland, delivered a victim impact statement that left few dry eyes in the courtroom. At the start, she asked Llewellyn directly, "Quake, will you look at me in the eyes?" He did. And then she spoke the questions that had haunted her for over a year. Why couldn't you just pass her? Why couldn't you just pass my daughter? Did she fight you? Did she cry? Did she ask for her brothers? Maggie continued, "Justice for Sydney is all I ever wanted this past year for my daughter, which you took 4 days ago from us. We'll never get back." After the hearing, she addressed the press. "Today, he pleaded guilty to murder and raping her and will spend the rest of his life in prison. But true justice for Sydney would be for her to be here." That was the heart of it, wasn't it? No sentence, no punishment, no amount of justice could bring Sydney back. The young woman who had chosen a career in nursing because she wanted to help people, who had devoted her life to caring for others, who had lived by the philosophy that the purpose of life is to give away the gifts you've been given. She was gone. All the potential, all the good she might have done in the world, all the lives she might have touched, stolen in an act of senseless violence on a lonely stretch of rural highway. Quake Llewellyn is currently serving his life sentence at an Arkansas Department of Corrections facility. He will never be eligible for parole. Barring a successful appeal, which seems unlikely given his guilty plea, he will die in prison. He's now in his early 30s. If he lives to average male life expectancy, he'll spend roughly another 45 to 50 years behind bars, waking every day to the reality of what he did, the lives he destroyed. In the years since Sydney's murder, her memory has been kept alive in her community. Friends and family share photos and memories on social media, ensuring that Sydney is remembered for who she was, not just how she died. The scholarship in her name continues to help aspiring healthcare professionals pursue their education, carrying forward Sydney's legacy of caring for others. The case also sparked conversations about the safety of women who run or exercise alone, particularly in rural areas. The hashtag running while female trended on social media, with women sharing their own experiences of harassment, fear, and the constant vigilance required to exercise in public spaces. Sydney's case became part of a larger dialogue about violence against women. Though statistics show such attacks by strangers are actually quite rare, cold comfort to those who must navigate the world with that threat hanging over them. For Jackson County, the case remains a wound that hasn't fully healed. The betrayal cut deep, not just the violence itself, but the fact that it came from within their own community, from a family they'd honored and respected. The realization that someone they'd trusted, someone who'd smiled and helped search for the very woman he'd killed, could harbor such darkness. It shattered something fundamental about how they understood their world. Sheriff David Lucas, who'd known both families, who'd responded to Maggie Sutherland's frantic call that Wednesday evening in August 2020, carried that weight too. In small communities, law enforcement officers aren't just doing a job. They're protecting their neighbors, their friends, people they've known for years. The personal nature of this crime made it all the harder to bear. The question of why has never been fully answered. Llewellyn maintained that the initial collision was an accident. But even if that were true, and many doubt it, given that he'd turned his truck around to go back to where he'd seen Sydney, nothing that followed was accidental. The rape, the burial, the cover-up, the joining of the search party. These were deliberate choices, acts of moral depravity that revealed something fundamentally broken in Quake Llewellyn's character. Dr. Willett's psychological evaluation found no evidence of mental disease or defect. Llewellyn wasn't insane. He wasn't unable to distinguish right from wrong. He knew what he was doing. He simply chose to do it anyway. And that perhaps is the most terrifying aspect of this case. There's no easy explanation, no diagnosis that makes sense of it. Sometimes evil exists without reason, without justification, without explanation. On a warm evening in late summer, when the sun hangs low over the rice fields of Jackson County, casting everything in golden light, you can almost imagine Sydney Sutherland jogging along those quiet roads, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her feet rhythmically striking the pavement, her breath steady, her mind perhaps wandering to her plans for the evening, or thinking about patients at the hospital, or simply enjoying the peace of the moment. Those roads are still there. The rice fields still stretch to the horizon. The small communities of Newport Grubbs and Tuckerman continue their quiet existence, bound together by family ties and shared history. But something has changed. An innocence has been lost. The doors that once remained unlocked might now have deadbolts. The women who jog along those rural highways might look over their shoulders more often, might carry pepper spray, might tell someone exactly where they're going and when they expect to be back. Sydney's family continues on, as families must, carrying their grief like a weight that never quite lifts. Her brothers Tyler and Sam, her nieces who called her Aunt Sassy, her parents Diane and Maggie, her boyfriend Alex. They all have to find ways to keep living in a world without Sydney. They've chosen to honor her memory by remembering the light she brought into the world, not the darkness that extinguished it. And in that choice, perhaps, there's a kind of victory. Quake Llewellyn took Sydney's future, but he couldn't take her past, couldn't erase the impact she'd had on the people who loved her, couldn't diminish the good she'd done in her 24 years. The scholarship that bears her name will help dozens, maybe hundreds of future nurses pursue their calling. Those nurses will care for thousands of patients over their careers. In that ripple effect, Sydney's gift, her compassion, her desire to help others continues to spread outward, touching lives she'll never know. That was what her senior quote had promised. The meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away. Sydney found her gift in caring for others. She was still in the early stages of giving it away when her life was cut short. But through the scholarship, through the memories shared by those who knew her, through the conversations her death sparked about women's safety and violence prevention, Sydney's gift continues to be given. It's not the way it should have been. It's not justice in any meaningful sense, but it's something, a small light persisting in the darkness, a reminder that even in the face of senseless tragedy, even when confronted with the worst that humanity can produce, there remains goodness worth fighting for, worth remembering, worth celebrating. Sydney Claire Sutherland was born on September 18, 1995. She died on August 19, 2020 at the age of 24. For 408 days, her family waited for justice. On October 1, 2021, they received as much justice as the legal system could provide. But the real justice would be for Sydney to still be here, still caring for patients, still running along those country roads, still bringing her light into a world that desperately needs it. That justice will never come. And so we do the only thing we can. We remember. We tell her story. Not just the tragedy of how she died, but the beauty of how she lived. We honor her memory by carrying forward the values she embodied. Kindness, compassion, dedication to helping others. The simple grace of a Ingham spirit. The rice fields of Jackson County grow and are harvested in their endless cycle. The White River flows on, as it has for thousands of years. Life continues in those small Arkansas towns, with all its joys and sorrows, triumphs and tragedies. And somewhere in that landscape of memory and loss, Sydney Sutherland's light still shines, diminished but not extinguished, a reminder of what was, what might have been, and what we owe to those we've lost. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.